The battle cries echoed across the heavens, shaking the very foundations of the world. A clash of gods, titans, and heroes, each fighting not just for power, but for survival. The earth trembled, and the sky darkened with the weight of conflict that could not be undone. In every corner of ancient Greece, war was more than a mere event. It was a story that shaped the lives of gods and men alike. Greek mythology paints a world where war was an eternal, inescapable part of existence. From the first spark of conflict between the Titans and the Olympians to the dust of Troy, every battle was more than just a fight for victory. It was a fight for meaning, for honor, for legacy. For the gods, war was not just about power. It was a reflection of their very nature, proud, jealous, vengeful, yet capable of mercy. Mortals fought not just for their lives, but for the gods' favor, for a place in stories that would echo through eternity. The gods, seemingly immortal and untouchable, were themselves bound by the rules of war. Zeus, with his thunderbolts, Ares, the god of war, and Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, were not distant from the chaos. They thrived in it. But they were also victims, caught in the web of their own divine struggles. Each battle was a dance of fate and choice, where one wrong move could shatter a life or an empire. The warriors who fought on the mortal side were no less entangled. Heroes like Achilles, with his rage that could tear cities apart, and Hector, whose honor would cost him everything, were more than men. They were symbols of the impossible choices that come when gods and men collide. Would they choose glory, knowing it could cost them their lives, or would they seek peace, knowing that might anger the gods? Even the armies themselves were not just collections of soldiers, they were individuals, each with their own hopes, dreams, and fears. The soldiers who marched in the great wars of mythology were often not looking for bloodshed but for something deeper. They wanted to prove their worth, to write their names in the stars, to be remembered. And in the world of Greek warfare, there was no greater honor than dying in battle. The shield of Achilles, with its stories of life and death etched into its surface, was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of the human struggle against fate. Yet, for all the glory that could come from battle, there was always a cost. The faces of those left behind, wives, children, parents, were painted in sorrow. The warriors were not just fighting for themselves, but for the families and kingdoms they might never see again. A mother's heart broke as she sent her son to battle, knowing he might never return. A lover's kiss was filled with the weight of a promise that might never be fulfilled. And then there were the gods, watching from their high thrones, whose hearts were as divided as those of the men who fought below. Their emotions, love, hate, jealousy, betrayal, were just as fierce, if not more so. The war for Troy wasn't just a war for the city, it was a war for the hearts of gods. The love of Helen, the beauty whose face launched 1,000 ships, was the spark that ignited the flames of the greatest conflict the world had ever known. But it was also the perfect storm of divine rivalry. Aphrodite, Hera, and Athena fought not just for the mortal world, but for their own pride. The gods' struggles for power mirrored the struggles of the men on the battlefield, as they used the mortals as pawns in a game that could never be won. The nature of Greek warfare, intertwined with the very essence of the gods, was something more profound than the clashing of armies. It was a reflection of human nature itself, filled with both light and darkness, moments of incredible courage and devastating cruelty. The soldiers who stood shoulder to shoulder on the plains of Troy or beneath the walls of Thebes were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for the right to be remembered. The blood spilled was not just for land or power, it was for legacy. Each strike of the sword, each cry of pain, each act of bravery was a part of something much larger, a story that would echo through the ages. It wasn't just the great heroes like Heracles or Odysseus whose stories would live on forever. It was every man who fought in the shadows, every soul who gave everything in the name of their gods and kings. The gods themselves knew that war was never simply about victory or defeat. It was about the stories that would be told long after the dust settled. And so, they watched as heroes fell and cities crumbled, knowing that their names would never be forgotten. The wars of Greek mythology were not just tales of bloodshed, they were the stories of life itself. Every battle told a tale of struggle, sacrifice, and survival. From the rage of Achilles to the fall of Troy, every conflict was a reminder that the gods, too, were trapped by their own desires, and that even immortals could not escape the consequences of their actions. In the end, there was no true victor in these wars, only those whose stories survived. The sky burned with fire and chaos. The earth shuddered as mountains crumbled, rivers boiled, and the air was thick with the cries of war. This was no ordinary battle. It was a war that would reshape existence itself, a war between the ancient titans, the colossal rulers of the cosmos, and the Olympian gods, young and unyielding, fighting to take their place in the world. Cronus, the mighty leader of the titans, stood at the heart of the storm. His scythe gleamed in the dim light as he roared, defying anything that dared challenge his reign. The titans, vast and powerful, were forces of nature themselves. Their bodies were like mountains, their voices could crack the sky. For ages, they had ruled the cosmos, their will shaping the very fabric of reality. But now, their time was slipping away. The children they had once tried to destroy, the Olympians, had risen, and they were coming for their thrones. Zeus, the youngest of Cronus's children, stood unbroken and unbowed. His eyes burned like lightning as he raised his hand to the heavens. He had been hidden away as a child, spared the fate of his siblings who were swallowed whole by Cronus in his fear of a prophecy that foretold his fall. Zeus had grown strong in secret, waiting for the moment to fulfill that prophecy and challenge his father. This was that moment. The Titans had the strength of the ancient world behind them. They wielded the raw forces of creation, each step shaking the ground, each strike like a storm unleashed. But the Olympians had something else: determination, unity, and an unshakable hunger for freedom. Zeus, alongside his brothers Poseidon and Hades, his sisters Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, fought with a fury born from years of oppression. They had been betrayed before they had even begun to live, and now they sought justice, vengeance, and their rightful place. The battlefield stretched across the cosmos. Oceans churned as Poseidon unleashed his trident, creating waves that swallowed entire lands. Hades, with shadows clinging to his form, summoned the dead to fight alongside the living, their hollow cries echoing through the endless chaos. Hera, fierce and unyielding, led the charge with the cunning of a warrior queen. Together, the Olympians were a storm that the Titans could not ignore. But the Titans were not alone. Towering beasts and primordial monsters joined their cause. Typhon, a creature so terrifying that even the gods hesitated, brought with him storms and destruction. Each clash between the forces shook the very core of existence. The Cyclopes, one-eyed craftsmen of incredible skill, forged weapons for the Olympians: Zeus's thunderbolts, Poseidon's trident, and Hades' helmet of invisibility. These tools would turn the tide of the war. The battle raged for 10 years, a war that seemed to have no end. Every strike of Zeus's thunderbolt lit up the heavens, and every swing of Cronus's scythe cut through mountains. The skies wept fire, the earth bled rivers of molten rock, and the air itself seemed to scream in agony. Mortals who lived in the shadow of these ancient powers could only cower, praying to gods who had not yet claimed their dominion. There were moments of despair, when it seemed the Titans' might would crush the rebellion. Cronus stood tall, his laughter like rolling thunder, as he drove the Olympians back again and again. The Titans fought with a ferocity born of desperation, for they knew what was at stake. If they lost, it would not just be their rule that ended, but their very existence. To lose was to be cast into the abyss of Tartarus, a prison from which none could escape. But the Olympians refused to yield. Zeus stood at the center of their resistance, his voice a rallying cry that inspired his siblings to fight harder, to strike with more precision, to never lose hope. He reminded them of their past, the years of darkness, the pain of being consumed and imprisoned, and he painted a vision of what the future could hold. They fought not just to end the reign of the Titans, but to create a new world, one where they would be free to rule, to love, to live without fear. The final clash was unlike anything the cosmos had ever witnessed. Zeus unleashed a storm so powerful that the heavens themselves seemed to tear apart. Lightning bolts rained down like spears, striking the Titans with the fury of 1,000 storms. Poseidon raised a tidal wave that surged with unstoppable force, crashing into the Titans and scattering them like leaves in the wind. Hades, unseen and silent, struck from the shadows, his helm rendering him invisible as he took down enemy after enemy. Cronus, defiant to the end, faced his children one last time. His scythe gleamed as he swung it with all his might, aiming to cut Zeus down. But Zeus was ready. With a roar that shook the stars, he hurled his thunderbolt, the weapon crackling with the energy of a god's fury. The bolt struck Cronus with such force that the sky itself split open, a blinding light consuming everything for a moment that felt like an eternity. When the light faded, Cronus was gone, cast into the depths of Tartarus along with the Titans who had stood beside him. The war was over, but the echoes of its devastation lingered. The earth bore scars that would never fully heal, and the air still hummed with the energy of a battle that had ended an era. The Olympians, victorious but not unscathed, stood among the ruins of the old world. Their victory was not just over the Titans but over the fear and oppression that had once ruled their lives. They had fought not only with weapons but with their hearts, with the belief that they could create something better. And though the cost had been immense, they had claimed their thrones, their power, and their place in the cosmos. The ground cracked open, and from the depths of the earth, giants rose, their forms towering and grotesque, their eyes burning with rage and vengeance. They carried the weight of fury born not of ambition, but of resentment, a grudge against the gods who ruled from their gleaming thrones on Olympus. The heavens themselves seemed to hold their breath as the Gigantomachy began, a battle that would decide who truly owned the cosmos. The giants were unlike anything the gods had faced before. Each one was a force of destruction, their massive hands gripping weapons forged from the earth's fiery core. They were born of Gaia, the primordial goddess of the earth, and she had created them with a single purpose, to overthrow the Olympians who had cast her beloved children, the Titans, into the black abyss of Tartarus. This wasn't just a battle for power, it was a war born of betrayal and anguish. The gods, though mighty, knew fear that day. The giants were relentless, their strength rivaling that of the Olympians themselves. Porphyrion, the leader of the giants, was a monster among monsters, his voice a booming roar that echoed across the heavens. He raised a massive spear, its tip glowing with the heat of molten rock, and hurled it toward Olympus. The spear shattered mountains as it flew, its force shaking the foundations of the god's sanctuary. But Zeus would not let Olympus fall. Standing atop the peak of the mountain, his figure silhouetted against the storm-filled sky, he called forth thunder and lightning. With a sweep of his arm, bolts of raw energy shot from his hand, striking the giants and lighting up the battlefield. The clash of power was deafening, the sky a riot of fire and shadows. For every giant struck down, another rose to take its place, their numbers seeming endless. Hera, fierce and unyielding, fought beside Zeus. Her golden crown gleamed in the chaos as she used her divine powers to shield her fellow gods and hurl waves of destruction at the giants. But even she struggled to hold her ground against their ferocity. A giant's club struck the earth near her, sending a shockwave that nearly toppled her. Yet, with defiance in her eyes, she stood tall, her voice a rallying cry for the gods. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, fought with precision and grace. She wielded her spear with unmatched skill, each strike a calculated move meant to exploit the giant's weaknesses. Enceladus, one of the fiercest giants, charged at her, his massive fists swinging with enough force to shatter mountains. But Athena was quick, sidestepping his attacks and driving her spear into his chest. The giant let out a roar of agony as he fell, shaking the ground with his collapse. Apollo, with his golden bow, rained arrows of sunlight upon the giants. His shots pierced through their thick hides, each one finding its mark. Artemis, his twin sister, moved like a shadow through the chaos, her arrows striking with deadly accuracy. The siblings fought as one, their unity a testament to the strength of the Olympians. Yet, for all their might, the gods could not win this war alone. The giants were protected by a prophecy that declared they could only be defeated by a mortal. Zeus, aware of this, turned to the mortal world for aid. From among men, he called upon Heracles, a hero of unmatched strength and courage. Born of Zeus but raised as a man, Heracles was the key to the gods' victory. Heracles entered the battlefield, his presence a beacon of hope. Armed with a bow and arrows dipped in the venom of the Hydra, he faced the giants without hesitation. His first arrow found its target in Alcyoneus, a giant so powerful he could not die on his native land. Heracles, with his cunning, dragged the wounded giant across the border, and as Alcyoneus breathed his last, the tide of the battle began to turn. The war raged on, each moment more brutal than the last. Blood, both divine and monstrous, stained the earth, and the air was filled with the screams of the wounded and dying. The giants fought with the desperation of those who knew this was their last stand, while the gods and their allies pressed on with unwavering determination. The battlefield became a place of nightmares, where the ground was littered with the broken bodies of giants and the shattered remnants of Olympus's defenses. Zeus unleashed his full fury, his thunderbolts tearing through the ranks of the giants. Poseidon, wielding his trident, summoned tidal waves that drowned their foes. Hades, unseen and silent, used his helm of invisibility to strike from the shadows, his blows always lethal. Even Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, joined the fight, wielding a staff that turned the giants' blood into streams of poison. Heracles proved to be the god's greatest weapon. He hunted the giants with unrelenting resolve, his arrows bringing down even the mightiest among them. His strength was matched only by his courage, and his presence inspired the gods to fight harder. One by one, the giants fell, their roars of defiance fading into silence. The battle reached its climax when Porphyrion, the leader of the giants, faced Zeus and Heracles. With a roar that shook the heavens, Porphyrion charged, his weapon raised high. Zeus met his attack with a thunderbolt, the impact creating an explosion of light and sound that blinded and deafened all who witnessed it. Heracles seized the moment, firing an arrow that pierced the giant's heart. Porphyrion let out one final, earth-shaking cry before collapsing, his massive form lying lifeless on the battlefield. As the last of the giants fell, silence descended. The earth, scarred and broken, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The gods, bloodied but victorious, stood among the ruins, their faces marked by exhaustion and triumph. Olympus had been saved, but the cost had been great. The echoes of the Gigantomachy would linger, a reminder of the battle that almost brought the gods to their knees. The night sky was silent, but the silence carried a tension that felt alive. Stars blinked coldly in the vast darkness, unaware of the storm brewing beneath them. The earth trembled softly, as though it, too, could feel the weight of an ancient injustice. It was a time before the gods, before the mortal world as we know it, a time when the heavens and the earth were bound by chains of cruelty and fear. And at the center of it all stood Uranus, the primordial sky, watching over a kingdom built on oppression. Uranus loomed vast and unyielding, his presence stretching endlessly across the heavens. To mortals, his domain might have seemed serene, but beneath that endless expanse was a father's tyranny. His wife, Gaia, the earth itself, bore his children, mighty beings known as the Titans, the Cyclopes, and the Centaurs. But Uranus, consumed by paranoia and disgust, saw his children as threats to his rule. One by one, he cast them into the depths of Tartarus, a place so dark and desolate that even light dared not venture there. Gaia's heart ached as her offspring were ripped from her, imprisoned for the crime of existing. For ages, Uranus's cruelty went unchallenged. His laughter echoed through the skies as he reveled in his power. But Gaia, though wounded, was not powerless. She could feel the cries of her children echoing through her very being, and with every cry, her resolve hardened. She began to scheme, her anger simmering like magma beneath the earth's crust. It was not revenge she sought, but liberation, a chance for her children to rise from the shadows and claim the lives they had been denied. Gaia turned to her remaining sons, the Titans who had not yet been imprisoned. She whispered her plan to them, her voice trembling with fury and hope. But fear gripped the hearts of most. Who could stand against Uranus, the embodiment of the sky itself? The thought of defying him was unthinkable. All but one of her children shrank from the task. Cronus, her youngest son, stepped forward. His eyes burned with a mix of defiance and ambition. Unlike his siblings, he was not cowed by the thought of challenging Uranus. He had seen enough of his father's tyranny, and he longed to break the cycle. Cronus's heart was not pure. He was driven by his own desires as much as by a sense of justice, but in that moment, he became Gaia's hope. Gaia handed Cronus a weapon of unimaginable power, a sickle made of unbreakable adamantine, sharp enough to slice through the very fabric of existence. She placed it in his hands, her voice steady despite the fears that clung to her like a shadow. "Strike," she told him. "Strike, and free us all." When night fell, Cronus waited in the shadows, the sickle clutched tightly in his hands. Above him stretched the vast expanse of Uranus, his father, unaware of the storm about to erupt. Cronus's heart pounded like a war drum. He knew the risk. Failure meant death, not just for him, but for Gaia and his siblings. But the thought of enduring another moment under Uranus's rule steeled his resolve. The ambush was swift, brutal, and final. As Uranus descended to the earth, unaware of the trap laid for him, Cronus leapt from his hiding place. The sickle arced through the air, its blade catching the faint starlight before it struck. The sound was not a roar but a guttural, cosmic groan, as if the universe itself recoiled from the blow. Cronus's strike was precise and merciless, severing Uranus's power at its core. The sky seemed to shatter for a moment, stars trembling in their places as Uranus's dominance was broken. The blood of Uranus spilled across the earth, and from it, new life emerged. The Furies, spirits of vengeance, rose from the drops that fell to the ground, their forms dark and foreboding. From other droplets, the giants and nymphs were born. The cosmos seemed to shift, as if exhaling after holding its breath for eons. Uranus's voice, once so commanding, now faded into a distant whisper, his power reduced to nothing more than a memory. Cronus stood amidst the chaos, the sickle in his hand and his father's blood on his skin. He had done what no one thought possible. The reign of Uranus was over. But as the dust settled, Cronus's gaze turned not to freedom, but to the throne now left vacant. He had freed his siblings, yes, but in doing so, he had also claimed a new kind of power. The cycle of tyranny, it seemed, was not so easily broken. Gaia watched her son ascend to power with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The sky no longer loomed with menace, but the earth knew that peace was not yet assured. Cronus, the liberator, had tasted the intoxicating sweetness of victory, and his eyes gleamed with the promise of a new reign, his reign. For though the heavens no longer bore Uranus's chains, the world was not yet free. It had merely exchanged one ruler for another, and the seeds of another war had already begun to take root. The warmth of fire spread through the land, yet in its glow, there was a darkness that no one could escape. The gods had given everything, power, beauty, control, but there was one thing they held above all else, knowledge. They kept it to themselves, away from mortals, locked in the heavens, far beyond the reach of those who walked on the earth. They did not want men to know. They did not want them to rise. They feared what could happen if their creations ever gained freedom. But Prometheus, the titan who had once been one of them, saw a different truth. He watched the humans struggle, their lives short and full of hardship, their fires dim compared to the eternal flame of the gods. He saw their yearning, their desperate desire for something more, something they couldn't have. It wasn't cruelty that drove him. It was love. A love for those who had been cast into darkness, for those who could never know the light of the gods. His heart ached for them. So, one night, when the gods slept beneath their clouded palaces, Prometheus climbed the mountain of Olympus, unnoticed, and took the flame. He held it carefully, cradling it as though it were the very soul of the earth, the essence of life itself. And when he reached the world of men, he offered them what he had stolen, fire. With that simple gift, he gave them warmth, light, and hope. He gave them the chance to rise. The first spark in their hearts ignited something greater than fire. It was the flicker of freedom. For the first time, humans felt something stir inside them, something that told them they could be more than just slaves to the gods' will. They could build, they could create, they could fight for themselves. And for Prometheus, seeing the humans hold that flame aloft, knowing they had the power to change their own fates, was a victory greater than anything the gods could ever offer. But that victory came at a cost. When the gods awoke and saw what Prometheus had done, their anger was swift and fierce. Zeus, the king of the gods, stood at the peak of Olympus, his eyes blazing with fury. "How dare you," he thundered. "How dare you defy the order of the heavens? You were given life and strength to serve us, not to take what is ours." Prometheus, unmoved by Zeus's wrath, stood tall. "I did not steal from you," he said, his voice calm, even in the face of inevitable punishment. "I gave them the one thing you never would, the gift of freedom. The gift of life." The gods could not fathom such rebellion. They were rulers, supreme in every way, and mortals were nothing but tools to be used for their own amusement. To give the humans the power to choose their own fate was the ultimate betrayal. For Zeus, it was a challenge to his throne, a spark of disobedience that could grow into a fire too dangerous to ignore. He had to make an example of Prometheus, or the balance of the world would crumble. The punishment was as brutal as it was eternal. Prometheus was bound to a rock, chained by his wrists and ankles, where the sky stretched endlessly above him. Every day, an eagle, a creature sent by Zeus, would come to feast on his liver. And every night, the liver would grow back, only to be devoured again by the ravenous bird. It was an agonizing cycle, a reminder of Prometheus's defiance. Yet even in the face of unthinkable pain, Prometheus never cried out. His eyes, full of sorrow, stayed fixed on the horizon, knowing that what he had done was worth the cost. And in the hearts of humans, the fire burned brighter. Though they had lost their protector, they had gained something even more precious, the knowledge of their own potential. The gods could take everything from them, but they could never take away the flame that had been passed down to them, the spark of life that no divine being could extinguish. Time passed. Years, centuries, eons. The world changed. Empires rose and fell, wars were fought, and knowledge spread like wildfire across the earth. But Prometheus remained, chained to the rock, his torment never ceasing. Yet he never regretted his choice. The flames he had given to mankind could not be put out. He had planted a seed, and though he could never see the fruits of his labor, he knew that humanity would grow stronger with every passing year. One day, after all hope seemed lost, a hero emerged from the shadows. Heracles, the greatest of heroes, a mortal born of divine blood, came to free Prometheus from his chains. With strength beyond measure, he broke the shackles that held the Titan, and for the first time in ages, Prometheus was free. The gods had punished him, but they could not destroy him. His spirit remained unbroken, his gift to mankind untouched. Prometheus looked to the sky, where the gods once reigned supreme, and for a moment, a tear traced his withered face. It wasn't a tear of sorrow, but one of understanding. He had given everything for this moment. And though the gods would never forgive him, though they would never understand his actions, he knew that the world was better for his defiance. He had sacrificed his body, his freedom, and his peace, but in doing so, he had ignited a flame that could never be extinguished. The gods could never take that away. The world had been forever changed by the simple act of giving, by the quiet rebellion that sparked the greatest gift of all, freedom. The air was thick with silence, the kind that presses on your chest and makes you hold your breath without realizing it. Darkness stretched endlessly, unbroken by stars or light. There was no sound, no shape, no life, only the vast, shapeless void. This was chaos, the beginning of all things, a swirling, untamed force that defied meaning and resisted order. It was raw, unpredictable, and infinite. But within chaos, a stirring began, faint at first, like the softest ripple in still water. It wasn't gentle, it was an insistent pull, a force yearning to break free. From that boundless nothingness, there emerged something new, order. A shape, a purpose, a will. It wasn't born gently, nor was it welcomed. Order was a rebellion against the very nature of chaos, a challenge to its endless, lawless reign. And chaos, vast and unyielding, would not surrender quietly. The first clash of chaos and order wasn't marked by weapons or armies, it was existence itself in conflict. Chaos fought with all its fury, unraveling what order tried to create, dissolving forms back into formlessness, swallowing structure with an endless hunger. But order was relentless. Where chaos scattered, order gathered. Where chaos tore apart, order rebuilt. Their battle shook the very fabric of existence, their struggle creating the first sparks of what would become the cosmos. And yet, the struggle wasn't just cosmic. It was deeply personal. Chaos wasn't just a void, it was alive, aware, furious. It lashed out, surging in violent waves, determined to crush this new force that dared to limit its freedom. And order wasn't merely a concept, it was willpower, a stubborn refusal to be consumed. Order stood firm, carving paths through chaos, forming structure where there had been only endless darkness. As their battle raged, the first shapes began to emerge from the chaos, stars ignited, their light piercing the void, the earth began to take form, solid and steadfast amid the storm. Mountains rose, rivers carved their way through rock, and the seas churned with a power borrowed from both chaos and order. It was as though the battlefield itself began to transform, each strike leaving behind a scar that grew into something new, something alive. But chaos was unrelenting. It hurled storms that shredded mountains, floods that swallowed the earth. It wasn't just destruction, it was defiance, a refusal to be caged or tamed. Chaos surged like a tide, overwhelming order's careful work, undoing progress in the blink of an eye. For every star order placed in the sky, chaos sought to snuff it out, dragging it back into the void. Order, though battered, did not falter. It gathered its strength, weaving the remnants of chaos's destruction into new creations. Where chaos shattered, order pieced together. And slowly, painfully, something remarkable began to happen. Chaos's fury became less wild, its surges less destructive. For the first time, there was balance, a fragile, trembling balance that neither side had sought but could not deny. From that balance, life began to stir. The first beings emerged, born of chaos's raw energy and order's steady hand. They were not gods, not yet, but they were alive, their hearts beating with the echoes of the Great War. They carried within them the duality of their creators, a spark of chaos, wild and untamed, and a touch of order, steady and purposeful. But the war was far from over. Chaos, though weakened, refused to yield. It sent storms of darkness to reclaim what it had lost, seeking to drown the fledgling world in its unending void. Order responded with a ferocity born of desperation, pushing back with all its might, weaving the light tighter, the form stronger. Their conflict roared across the heavens, shaking the stars, boiling the seas, and splitting the earth. Amid the chaos, cracks began to form, not in the battlefield, but in the very nature of chaos and order themselves. Chaos, once infinite and formless, began to take shape, its essence fragmenting into pieces, each carrying a piece of its wild fury. These fragments became the first primordial beings, forces of nature that roamed the world, embodying the storm, the sea, the fire. Order, too, began to change. Its rigid structure softened, its endless pursuit of control tempered by the realization that too much order could choke the very life it sought to protect. From its essence came beings of purpose, guardians of creation who sought to nurture and protect the fragile balance they had fought so hard to create. The battle slowed, not because it ended, but because both chaos and order began to see that their struggle had birthed something neither could have imagined. Their war had given rise to life, to beauty, to the first whispers of harmony. Chaos's rage became storms that brought rain, life to the parched earth. Order's control became seasons, cycles that gave rhythm to the world. And yet, beneath that fragile peace, the echoes of their battle lingered. Chaos still surged, still pushed against the boundaries order had set. And order, though less rigid, still sought to shape and contain. Their struggle was not over, it would never be over, but it had shifted. It was no longer a war of destruction, but a dance, a balance that would shape the world for ages to come. Even as the first gods began to rise, claiming their thrones in the heavens, they carried the scars of that first war. They were born of the balance between chaos and order, their power a reflection of that eternal struggle. Zeus's thunder, Poseidon's seas, Hades' underworld, all bore the mark of the conflict that had forged their world. And though chaos and order had retreated from the battlefield, their war continued, not in the heavens, but in the hearts of those they had created. For every storm, there was a calm. For every act of creation, there was destruction. The battle of chaos and order was eternal, woven into the fabric of existence itself, a reminder of the first war, the war that gave birth to everything. It all began at a feast, a moment meant to celebrate union and joy, yet beneath the gilded halls and flowing wine, threads of envy and pride were already being woven into the fabric of fate. Gods and mortals mingled uneasily, their laughter hollow with the tension that always seemed to hang between the two worlds. Amid the splendor of the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, a single figure stood in the shadows, her presence uninvited yet impossible to ignore. Eris, the goddess of discord, held a golden apple in her hand. Its surface gleamed with an otherworldly light, and inscribed upon it were 3 haunting words, "To the fairest." The gods watched as she hurled the apple into their midst, a glittering trap that ensnared even their divine wisdom. 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, queen of the heavens; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, the embodiment of love and beauty. Each saw herself as the rightful owner, each believed she was the fairest of all. Their voices, calm at first, soon rose into sharp demands, their divine tempers threatening to tear apart the fragile peace of the feast. Zeus, burdened by the weight of their expectations, refused to judge. Instead, he sent them to a mortal, Paris, a prince of Troy whose choice would shape the destiny of empires. Paris stood on the green hills of Mount Ida, his heart pounding as the 3 goddesses descended before him. Their radiance was blinding, their presence overwhelming. Hera stepped forward first, her voice firm and commanding. She promised him power, the rule over all mortal kingdoms. Athena came next, her gaze sharp and knowing. She offered him unmatched wisdom, victory in every battle, the strength of 1,000 warriors. Finally, Aphrodite approached, her words soft and sweet, her smile more enchanting than the sun. She offered him love, love so consuming it would burn away everything else. Paris, with a mortal heart that beat for desire more than reason, chose Aphrodite. In return, she gave him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. But Helen was not Aphrodite's to give. She was the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta, bound to him by sacred vows and the fragile threads of mortal peace. Paris, captivated by her beauty, ignored the cost. He stole her away, carrying her across the seas to Troy, his homeland, where love's fire would soon ignite the flames of war. The betrayal shattered Menelaus. He was not just a husband who had lost his wife, he was a king whose pride had been trampled by a foreign prince. His grief turned quickly to rage, a fury that demanded retribution. He called upon his brother, Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece, to help him reclaim what was his. Together, they summoned the might of the Greek armies, gathering heroes and warriors whose names would echo through eternity: Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, Diomedes. They sailed to Troy, their ships darkening the horizon, their hearts heavy with the promise of bloodshed. Troy, a city of high walls and unshakable pride, stood defiant against the oncoming storm. Its king, Priam, welcomed Paris and Helen, though his heart knew the price of their love would be steep. The Trojans prepared for war, their warriors sharpening their swords, their archers readying their bows. Among them was Hector, Priam's eldest son, a warrior of unmatched skill and honor, who carried the weight of his city's survival on his shoulders. He loved his brother, but he also saw the shadow that Paris's actions had cast over their home. As the Greeks landed on Trojan shores, the first clashes began. The beach turned red with the blood of soldiers, the cries of the dying mingling with the roar of the waves. Yet, even amid the chaos, the gods watched, their hands ever present in the affairs of mortals. Some sided with the Greeks. Hera and Athena, still bitter over Paris's choice, lent their strength to Menelaus and his army. Others, like Apollo and Aphrodite, stood with Troy, their divine favor shielding the city from the full force of Greek wrath. The war stretched on, year after year, each side gaining ground only to lose it again. The Greeks built their camps, their fires glowing like restless stars against the dark plains. The Trojans stood firm within their walls, their eyes ever watchful of the enemy that sought to tear them down. Heroes rose and fell, their deeds etched into the memories of those who survived. Achilles, the greatest of the Greeks, struck fear into the hearts of the Trojans, his rage unrelenting, his strength unmatched. Hector, noble and steadfast, became the shield of Troy, his courage a beacon for his people. And yet, the cause of it all remained shrouded in shadows, hidden behind the walls of Troy. Helen, the woman whose beauty had sparked the conflict, watched the war unfold from the palace towers. Her heart was heavy with guilt, her mind tormented by the lives lost in her name. She had not asked for this, nor had she chosen it. She was a pawn in a game played by gods and kings, her love a weapon more powerful than any sword. The war became more than a battle for a woman, it was a clash of pride, a struggle for honor, a test of the gods' power over mortals. Each life lost was a thread cut from the tapestry of history, each victory a fleeting moment in the endless dance of war. The Greeks burned with fury, their desire for vengeance driving them forward. The Trojans fought with desperation, their love for their city binding them together. As the sun set over the battlefield, its light painting the land in hues of gold and crimson, the air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths. This was not just a war of men, it was a battle of ideals, of desires that could never coexist. Love and pride, freedom and loyalty, each force clashed with the other, their collision giving rise to a storm that would echo through the ages. And as the flames of the Greek camp flickered against the night, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits, the gods watched. They watched as mortals bled for a cause they barely understood, as love and hatred wove together to create a tapestry of tragedy. This was their game, their eternal theater, and the mortals who fought and died were its players. But in the eyes of the soldiers, the heroes, the kings, and the women who mourned them, it was more than a game. It was everything. The battlefield fell silent, a quiet more unsettling than the chaos of war. Soldiers on both sides, hardened by years of bloodshed, felt an unfamiliar chill as they laid down their weapons. All eyes turned to the center of the plain, where two men, bound by fate and fury, stood facing each other. The sun hung high, its relentless glare beating down on Paris of Troy and Menelaus of Sparta. This wasn't just a duel. It was the embodiment of everything they fought for: love, honor, vengeance. Paris, the prince of Troy, stood with his bow in hand, his grip steady but his heart uncertain. His armor gleamed, yet there was something fragile in his posture. His handsome face bore no scars, no signs of the toil that war carved into a man's body. He was a symbol of passion and beauty, but today, beauty alone would not save him. Across from him stood Menelaus, his rival, his victim. The Spartan king radiated raw power, his broad shoulders carrying the weight of betrayal and rage. His sword gleamed in the sun, and his shield bore the marks of countless battles. His eyes were like burning coals, fixed on Paris with an intensity that seemed to scorch the very air between them. The gods, perched on Mount Olympus, watched with bated breath. Zeus, the arbiter of justice, had decreed that this duel would decide the fate of the war. If Paris won, Helen would remain in Troy, and the Greeks would return home, their mission a failure. If Menelaus triumphed, Helen would be restored to her husband, and the city of Troy would face retribution. But the gods, as always, could not resist meddling. Each had their favorites, and their whispered schemes swirled invisibly around the combatants. Paris was the first to move, knocking an arrow to his bow. His fingers trembled, a slight but telling crack in the facade of confidence he wore. He released the arrow, and it hissed through the air like a serpent. Menelaus raised his shield with the practiced ease of a warrior born, and the arrow struck with a hollow thud, harmless. Paris hesitated, his breath caught in his throat. Menelaus seized the moment, charging forward with a roar that echoed like thunder. His spear flew from his hand, slicing through the air with lethal precision. Paris barely managed to dodge, the weapon grazing his armor, leaving a jagged scratch as a reminder of how close death had come. The crowd of soldiers gasped, their collective intake of breath a reminder that, for all their differences, they were united in the gravity of this moment. On the walls of Troy, Helen watched, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She had loved Paris, or at least the idea of him, the young, daring prince who had risked everything to claim her. But as she saw him now, struggling to hold his ground against Menelaus, she wondered if love alone had ever been enough. Below her, Priam, the king of Troy, stood with his hand on the cold stone of the parapet, his face a mask of worry. He had always known that Paris's actions would bring ruin to his city. Now, he feared he was watching the first act of its destruction. Menelaus closed the distance between them, his sword swinging in a deadly arc. Paris stumbled, his footing unsure on the uneven ground. He raised his own sword to parry, but the force of Menelaus's strike drove him to his knees. The Spartan loomed over him, his breath ragged, his expression a blend of fury and triumph. With a guttural cry, Menelaus grabbed Paris by the crest of his helmet and wrenched him to his feet. The younger man's knees buckled, but Menelaus held him upright, his grip unyielding. He tore the helmet from Paris's head and flung it aside, revealing the face of a man stripped of all pretense. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Paris's eyes, wide with fear, met Menelaus's, burning with righteous wrath. In that instant, they were not just two men, they were the embodiment of two worlds colliding. Menelaus raised his sword high, the blade glinting like a shard of sunlight. But just as he prepared to deliver the final blow, something shifted in the air. A presence, unseen but undeniable, intervened. Aphrodite, the goddess who had promised Paris his prize, could not bear to see her chosen one fall. With a whisper of divine will, she shrouded him in a mist, pulling him from Menelaus's grasp and placing him far from the battlefield, safe within the walls of Troy. Menelaus swung his sword, but it cut through nothing but air. His triumphant roar turned to one of frustration as he realized his opponent had vanished. The soldiers murmured in confusion, their eyes darting between Menelaus and the empty space where Paris had been. The Spartans shouted accusations of cowardice, their voices rising in anger. The Trojans, though relieved, felt the sting of shame. A duel meant honor, and honor demanded that one of the combatants fall. To see their prince taken away by divine intervention was a wound to their pride. Menelaus stood alone on the battlefield, his chest heaving, his face contorted with rage. He raised his sword to the heavens, his voice raw with fury. "Coward," he bellowed, the word cutting through the silence like a blade. He turned to the Trojan army, his eyes blazing. "This is the man you call a prince? A thief who hides behind gods and walls?" The gods, watching from above, exchanged knowing glances. Their game was far from over, and this duel, though inconclusive, was just one move on the board. Zeus, ever the judge, frowned. Honor had not been satisfied, and the war would continue. The mortals, caught in the grip of forces far beyond their understanding, would fight on, their blood feeding the earth, their cries echoing through the ages. Helen, standing at her tower, felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She had been the spark that lit this fire, the prize over which men and gods alike clashed. But as she watched Menelaus return to the Greek camp, his sword still unsated, she realized that no victory, no reconciliation, could erase the scars that had already been carved into their lives. The battlefield, once a place of hope for resolution, returned to chaos. Soldiers picked up their weapons, the uneasy truce shattered. The war drums beat once more, their rhythm relentless, their sound a reminder that this was far from the end. And above it all, the gods watched, their laughter mingling with the cries of men, their hands shaping the fate of a world forever caught between love and honor. The night sky was heavy with smoke and whispers, the faint glow of distant fires casting eerie shadows on the walls of Troy. From atop those walls, the Trojan defenders could see the sprawling Greek camp, a sea of tents and flickering torches stretching to the horizon. The Greeks had been there for years, relentless in their siege, their resolve as unyielding as the stone that fortified the city. Yet Troy, proud and ancient, stood unbroken, its walls an impenetrable shield against the storm of war. Within the Greek camp, tension simmered like embers in a dying fire. Their greatest warriors, led by Agamemnon, plotted and schemed, each new plan more audacious than the last. The Greeks had tried force, sending wave after wave of soldiers to batter Troy's gates, only to be repelled by the cunning of the Trojans and the strength of their defenses. They had tried cunning, seeking to starve the city into submission, but Troy was a city of abundance, its stores vast and its spirit unbroken. Each failure deepened the Greeks' desperation, and desperation, like a cornered animal, bred innovation. Odysseus, the man of endless wiles, stood at the heart of these plans, his mind a labyrinth of strategy and deceit. He watched the walls of Troy with an intensity that bordered on obsession, searching for weakness where none seemed to exist. "Their strength is not in their walls," he murmured to those gathered around him one night, his voice low but firm. "It is in their unity, their belief that those walls make them invincible. Break that belief, and the walls will crumble." The Greeks began to shift their tactics, trading brute force for subtler strategies. They launched surprise attacks under the cover of darkness, scaling ladders that were met with showers of arrows and boiling oil. They dug trenches and built siege towers, towering constructs that reached toward the heavens but fell in splinters under the relentless counterattacks of the Trojans. Each attempt left the Greeks more battered, more determined. The Trojans, watching from their vantage points, took grim satisfaction in their victories but knew better than to grow complacent. They understood the resolve of their enemy, for it mirrored their own. Within the walls, life continued under the shadow of war. Markets bustled, children played, and priests offered sacrifices to the gods, their prayers echoing through the streets. Yet beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of fear, a quiet acknowledgement that even the strongest walls could not stand forever. Priam, the aged king of Troy, carried this burden heavily, his every step a testament to the weight of his people's hopes. He often stood upon the parapets, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as though searching for an answer in the endless expanse of sea and sky. Among the Trojans, none were more vital to the defense than Hector, their greatest warrior. His presence on the battlefield was like a storm unleashed, his spear and shield extensions of his unyielding will. The Greeks feared him, and the Trojans revered him, seeing in him the embodiment of their city's strength. Yet even Hector, for all his valor, was haunted by the cost of the war. He saw it in the faces of the men he led, and the grieving cries of widows and mothers. He bore it silently, knowing that his people needed a hero more than they needed his doubts. The Greeks, too, had their champions, men whose names would echo through eternity. Achilles, the golden-haired warrior, was a force of nature, his rage and prowess unmatched. But Achilles was not a man easily commanded. His pride burned brighter than the fires of the siege, and it often clashed with the ambitions of Agamemnon. When Achilles withdrew from the battlefield, the Greeks felt his absence keenly, their lines faltering under the renewed strength of the Trojan counterattacks. Yet even in his solitude, Achilles remained a specter over the war, his eventual return both feared and hoped for. The war's rhythms became a cruel dance, each side testing the other in an endless cycle of attack and defense. The Greeks, frustrated by their lack of progress, turned to the gods for favor, offering sacrifices and interpreting omens with desperate fervor. The Trojans, too, sought the will of the divine, their priests consulting the auguries and their warriors fighting with a conviction that came from their faith. Yet the gods, fickle and feuding, played their own games, their alliances and betrayals shaping the tide of the war as much as the actions of mortals. One fateful day, the Greeks launched a massive assault, their forces converging on Troy's gates in a surge of steel and fury. The Trojans met them with equal ferocity, the clash of weapons and the cries of men reverberating through the air. Arrows rained down like a storm, spears thrust and parried, and the ground was stained with the blood of both sides. Amid the chaos, Hector and Ajax, the towering Greek warrior, found themselves locked in single combat. Their battle was a tempest within the storm, a clash of titans that held the attention of friend and foe alike. Neither could gain the upper hand, their strength and skill perfectly matched, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, they parted, exhausted but alive, their mutual respect unspoken but profound. As the siege dragged on, both sides began to feel the strain. Supplies dwindled, morale wavered, and the endless cycle of violence took its toll. Yet neither could afford to surrender, for the stakes were too high. For the Greeks, it was a matter of pride and vengeance, a refusal to leave empty-handed after years of sacrifice. For the Trojans, it was survival, the defense of their home and their way of life. Amid this stalemate, whispers began to circulate among the Greeks of a plan so bold, so audacious, that it might finally turn the tide. Odysseus, ever the schemer, had conceived of a way to strike at the heart of Troy's strength, not its walls, but its trust. The plan would require patience, cunning, and no small amount of risk. But as the Greeks gathered around him to hear his proposal, a spark of hope flickered in their eyes, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, victory was still within reach. The siege of Troy was a crucible, a test of endurance and ingenuity, of courage and resolve. It was a battle not just of armies, but of wills, with each side pushing the other to the brink. And as the years stretched on, the question lingered, who would break first, the besiegers or the besieged? The answer lay not in the strength of their walls or the sharpness of their swords, but in the hearts of those who fought, their spirits forged in the fires of a war that would echo through the ages. The battlefield was drenched in crimson, a chaotic sea of clashing steel and desperate cries. Amid the carnage stood a figure who seemed otherworldly, a beacon of unyielding fury. Achilles, the son of Peleus and Thetis, the greatest warrior of his time, moved with a ferocity that left even the gods breathless. His armor gleamed despite the blood spattered upon it, his spear slicing through the air like a vengeful storm. To his enemies, he was death incarnate, a force that could not be stopped. Yet even Achilles, for all his power, could feel the weight of fate pressing upon him. He had always known his destiny, whispered to him by his immortal mother. Live a long, quiet life, or burn bright and die young, leaving an eternal legacy. Achilles had chosen the latter, and now, in the final days of the Trojan War, the shadows of that choice loomed closer. But Achilles did not fear death. What he feared was the idea of being forgotten, of his name fading into obscurity like so many others. So he fought not just to win, but to etch himself into the memory of the world. The Trojans had learned to dread the sight of him on the battlefield. His wrath was merciless, his movements as swift as the winds that carried his mother's voice. But it wasn't just his strength that made him invincible, it was his single-minded determination. He fought as if each swing of his sword was a declaration of his existence, a roar against the inevitability of time. Yet, there were cracks in his armor, not the bronze that shielded his body, but the emotions that weighed on his soul. The death of Patroclus, his dearest companion, had ignited the fury that now burned within him, but it had also left a void, an ache that no victory could fill. Achilles had avenged Patroclus by slaying Hector, the pride of Troy, but even as Hector's body lay beneath his chariot wheels, Achilles felt no peace. The vengeance had not healed him, it had only deepened the wound. As the days turned to weeks, the Trojans, though weary, held on to hope. The city's walls remained unbroken, its defenders driven by a desperate determination to survive. They knew that as long as Achilles lived, their survival was uncertain. And so whispers spread among the Trojans of a plan to strike at the heart of their greatest threat. The gods themselves seemed divided, their own grudges and loyalties shaping the tides of the war. Some favored Achilles, others sought his downfall. Among them, Apollo, the archer god, harbored a simmering resentment toward the Greek hero. The day dawned heavy with foreboding. The air was thick, the skies the bruised gray. Achilles strode into battle with the same unshakable confidence that had defined him since boyhood. His steps left imprints in the earth, his presence commanding attention from all who saw him. As he entered the fray, the fighting seemed to pause, as if even war itself had to acknowledge his arrival. He carved through the Trojan forces with precision, his spear finding its mark again and again. The Trojans fell back in terror, their cries blending into a cacophony of chaos. Achilles was relentless, his focus unbroken, his body moving with the grace of a predator. But in his fury, he failed to notice the subtle movements of fate aligning against him. High above, Apollo watched, his golden bow gleaming. The gods' hatred for Achilles had festered, fueled by slights and insults both real and perceived. Apollo saw an opportunity not just to end the Greeks' reign of terror, but to deliver a blow that would echo through eternity. He guided the hand of Paris, the prince of Troy, who stood trembling in the shadows, clutching a bow he barely knew how to wield. Paris, no warrior, no hero, was an unlikely instrument of destiny. Yet it was his hand that drew the bowstring, his eyes that sought out the one vulnerability in Achilles' otherwise impenetrable form. The arrow flew, silent and swift, cutting through the noise of battle. It struck true, piercing the heel of the greatest warrior the world had ever known. Achilles faltered, his steps unsteady for the first time. A gasp rippled through the battlefield as men on both sides froze, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The mighty Achilles, the man who had seemed untouchable, fell to his knees. Blood flowed from the wound, staining the ground beneath him. The invincible hero had been brought low. Yet even in his agony, Achilles was defiant. He rose to his feet, his spear still gripped tightly in his hand. His face was pale, his breathing labored, but his eyes burned with a fire that refused to be extinguished. He staggered forward, striking down the Trojans who dared approach him. His movements were slower, his strikes less precise, but his spirit was unbroken. The Greeks, seeing their champion wounded, rallied around him, forming a protective circle. They fought with a desperation that matched Achilles' own, determined to shield him from the advancing Trojans. But Achilles knew the truth. He could feel the life draining from him, his strength fading with each passing moment. He had always known this day would come, but knowing did not make it easier. As he sank to the ground, Achilles turned his gaze to the sky. He thought of his mother, Thetis, the sea goddess who had warned him of this fate. He thought of Patroclus, whose death had set him on this path of unrelenting vengeance. And he thought of the songs that would be sung about him, the stories that would keep his name alive long after his body had returned to the earth. The battle raged on around him, but Achilles heard none of it. His world was narrowing, his vision dimming. Yet even in his final moments, there was a strange sense of peace. He had lived as he had chosen, burning brightly, leaving an indelible mark on the world. The pain ebbed, replaced by a quiet stillness. When the Greeks finally carried his body from the battlefield, there was a silence that felt heavier than the weight of the war itself. The death of Achilles was not just the loss of a warrior, it was the end of an era, the extinguishing of a flame that had burned too brightly to last. The man who had seemed invincible had fallen, but in his fall, he became immortal. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the battlefield. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the distant cries of warriors locked in a struggle that seemed endless. Yet, in the heart of the chaos, silence fell. Two figures stood apart, their gazes locked, their fates intertwined. Achilles, the wrathful, the avenger, the demigod, faced Hector, the shield of Troy, the hope of his people. Achilles' eyes burned with fury, the grief of Patroclus' death fueling an unrelenting fire within him. Every fiber of his being demanded vengeance. Hector, by contrast, bore the weight of a city on his shoulders. He stood tall, his resolve etched into his features, but his heart was heavy. He knew what lay ahead. He had seen it in the eyes of his wife, Andromache, and heard it in the wails of his son. Yet, he could not run. To flee would be to betray everything he stood for. The air between them seemed alive, crackling with the tension of the inevitable. Achilles raised his spear, his grip steady, his movements precise. Hector tightened his shield, the weight of it familiar yet oppressive. Time slowed as they circled one another, each step deliberate, each breath heavy. The world beyond them blurred into insignificance. This was their moment, a clash of titans whose names would echo through eternity. Achilles struck first, his spear slicing through the air with deadly intent. Hector deflected the blow with his shield, the force of it reverberating through his arm. He retaliated with a strike of his own, aiming for Achilles' chest, but the Greek warrior was too fast, dodging the attack with ease. Their weapons clashed, the sound sharp and piercing, cutting through the stillness that had enveloped the battlefield. Hector fought with a desperation born of love for his city and his family. He was not just defending himself, he was defending Troy, its people, its future. But Achilles was relentless, his movements a blur of speed and precision. Each strike carried the weight of his grief, his anger, his unyielding thirst for revenge. The fight was not just physical, it was a battle of wills, a test of who would break first. Hector stumbled, his footing momentarily faltering on the uneven ground. Achilles seized the opportunity, his spear thrusting forward with unerring accuracy. Hector barely managed to raise his shield in time, the force of the blow driving him back. His breath came in ragged gasps, his strength waning. But still, he stood. He could not fall. Not yet. The battle dragged on, their movements growing slower, their strikes less precise. Sweat and blood mingled on their skin, their bodies pushed to the brink. Achilles' rage was a storm, unrelenting and all-consuming. Hector's determination was a shield, steadfast and unyielding. Each was a force unto themselves, unstoppable in their own right. But fate is a cruel master, and it had already chosen its victor. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the battlefield in a golden glow, Achilles saw his opening. Hector's shield slipped, leaving his chest exposed for the briefest of moments. It was all Achilles needed. His spear found its mark, piercing Hector's flesh and driving him to the ground. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers, a sound of disbelief and grief. Hector lay on the blood-soaked earth, his body trembling, his breath shallow. Achilles stood over him, his expression a mix of triumph and something darker, something emptier. The vengeance he had sought, the rage that had driven him, now felt hollow. Hector's eyes met Achilles, and in that moment, there was no anger, no hatred. There was only acceptance. His voice was weak but steady as he spoke, his words carrying the weight of a man who knew he had done his duty. Achilles listened, his expression unreadable, but his heart was heavy. For all his strength, all his power, he could not escape the truth. Hector had died a hero, his honor intact, while Achilles' victory had only deepened his grief. The silence that followed was deafening. Achilles' men cheered, their voices ringing hollow in his ears. The Trojans wept, their hope extinguished. And Achilles, the greatest warrior of his age, stood alone, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a crushing tide. The fires had dimmed, and the air was eerily still. For 10 years, the Greeks had battered the walls of Troy, their hopes dwindling with each passing day. The siege had taken its toll on both sides, leaving a wasteland of broken weapons and shattered dreams. But now, silence reigned, broken only by the distant cries of seagulls circling the shores. The Greek ships were gone, their camps abandoned, and in their place, a colossal wooden horse stood in mute defiance before the gates of Troy. The Trojans emerged cautiously from behind their fortified walls, their eyes wide with disbelief. Could it be true? Had the Greeks finally given up? The horse loomed large, its polished wood gleaming in the sunlight, a marvel of craftsmanship and mystery. Some whispered that it was a gift, an offering to the gods to atone for the Greek defeat. Others, more skeptical, saw it as a trap, though even they could not imagine the true horror hidden within its hollow frame. The people of Troy gathered in the shadow of the horse, their voices rising in a cacophony of debate. Priam, the weary king, stood at the gates, his face etched with years of war and loss. He listened as his advisors argued, their voices a mix of excitement and caution. Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Beware the Greeks, even when they bear gifts," he warned, his tone sharp with conviction. But his words fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the growing fervor of the crowd. The Trojans, weary of war, saw the horse not as a threat but as a symbol of victory, a tangible proof that the gods had finally smiled upon them. Laocoon's descent was short-lived. As if in response to his defiance, 2 serpents emerged from the sea, their massive coils glistening with salt water. They struck with terrifying speed, wrapping themselves around Laocoon and his sons, their screams echoing through the air before being silenced forever. The Trojans gasped in horror, but many saw the event as a divine sign. The horse was no longer a question, it was a command from the gods themselves. With great effort, the Trojans pulled the horse through their gates, its massive wheels grinding against the stone streets. Cheers erupted as the people celebrated what they believed was the end of their suffering. Wine flowed freely, and songs of triumph filled the air as the city came alive with joy for the first time in years. But as night fell, the mood shifted. The fires burned low, and a strange unease settled over the city. The horse stood silent and immovable in the heart of Troy, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to flicker with life. Inside its wooden belly, Greek warriors waited, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding. Odysseus, the mastermind of this cunning plan, tightened his grip on his sword, his mind racing with the weight of what was to come. The city slept, lulled into a false sense of security. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional cry of a distant owl. Then, a single torchlight flickered at the gates. The Greek ships, hidden just beyond the horizon, had returned under the cover of darkness. A signal was sent, a brief burst of flame cutting through the night, and the warriors inside the horse began to move. The wooden hatch creaked open, the sound barely audible above the whispers of the wind. One by one, the Greeks emerged, their weapons gleaming in the pale moonlight. They moved like shadows, swift and silent, their hearts pounding with the thrill of their audacious gamble. Odysseus led the charge, his eyes scanning the city for signs of resistance. None came. The gates of Troy were thrown open, and the Greek army flooded in, their battle cries shattering the stillness. The Trojans, caught between sleep and confusion, were utterly unprepared. What had been a night of celebration turned into a nightmare of blood and fire. The Greeks moved with ruthless efficiency, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. The streets ran red, and the wails of the dying filled the air. Priam met his end in the sanctity of his palace, his blood staining the altar where he had prayed for deliverance. Andromache clutched her son, her cries piercing as she was dragged away. Helen, the woman whose beauty had sparked the war, stood in the shadows, her face a mask of grief and resignation as Menelaus approached her. The gods watched in silence, their hands stained with the tragedy they had set in motion. By dawn, Troy was no more. The city that had withstood 10 years of siege had fallen in a single night, betrayed by its own faith and the cunning of its enemies. The horse stood among the ruins, a grim reminder of the cost of hubris and the lengths to which men would go for victory. The smoke rose in thick, choking clouds, painting the dawn sky in hues of ash and despair. Troy, the city that had stood proud and unyielding for a decade, now lay in ruins, its once mighty walls crumbled, its streets slick with blood. The cries of the dying echoed alongside the crackling flames, a symphony of sorrow that seemed to pierce even the heavens. The gods watched in silence, their hands heavy with guilt and their eyes devoid of mercy. Amid the chaos, a mother clutched her child, her face streaked with soot and tears. She ran through the wreckage, her bare feet torn by the jagged stones. The child whimpered in her arms, too young to understand the devastation, but old enough to feel its weight. Around them, the destruction was absolute, homes reduced to charred skeletons, temples desecrated, and the bodies of warriors and innocents alike strewn like broken dolls. In the heart of the city, Priam's palace stood as a hollow monument to what once was. The great king, who had defied the Greeks with a dignity born of unshakable faith, now lay lifeless, his blood pooling beneath him. The altar where he had prayed for salvation was stained red, the gods he had worshipped offering no reprieve. Hecuba, his queen, knelt beside him, her wails rising like a dirge that reverberated through the ruins. Her grief was not hers alone, it was the grief of a civilization brought to its knees. The Greeks, ruthless in their triumph, moved through the city with purpose. Soldiers tore through the remnants of Troy, dragging captives and looting treasures. The golden idols of the gods were wrenched from their pedestals, their gleaming forms now symbols of defeat rather than divinity. Helen, the woman at the center of it all, stood among the ashes, her beauty undiminished but her heart heavy with regret. She was led away, her face a mask of resigned sorrow as the city burned behind her. Every corner of Troy bore witness to its downfall. The marketplace, once alive with the vibrant hum of trade and laughter, was now a battlefield littered with bodies. The fountains that had once sparkled with crystal-clear water now ran dark with blood. The wind carried the acrid stench of smoke and death, a cruel reminder of the cost of pride and ambition. In the shadows, a few survivors huddled together, their faces hollow with despair. Aeneas, the Trojan prince, stood among them, his shoulders heavy with the burden of survival. He held the hand of his young son, Ascanius, while his aged father, Anchises, leaned on him for support. Their eyes met, and in that moment, unspoken words passed between them, a promise to endure, to carry the spirit of Troy beyond its smoldering ruins. The sea reflected the fiery destruction, its waves lapping hungrily at the shore as if to swallow the city whole. Greek ships, now laden with spoils, anchored proudly in the distance, their sails catching the morning light. Odysseus, the architect of Troy's fall, stood on the deck of one such ship, his gaze fixed on the ruins. Victory was his, yet his expression was far from joyous. He knew the gods were fickle, and their favor could shift like the winds at sea. The burden of what he had wrought would follow him, a shadow that no triumph could erase. As the sun climbed higher, the scale of the tragedy became even clearer. Troy was no longer a city, it was a graveyard. The echoes of its once proud history lingered in the ruins, haunting reminders of what had been lost. Children's toys laid abandoned in the dust, their innocence forever shattered. Broken shields and shattered swords marked the places where warriors had made their final stands. And yet, even in its destruction, Troy refused to be forgotten. The spirit of its people, their resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, burned brighter than the flames consuming their homes. The fall of Troy was not just the end of a city, it was the beginning of a legend, a story that would echo through the ages. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as if every creature knew what lurked within its depths. The air hung heavy, damp with the promise of violence. Sunlight filtered through the thick canopy, but it seemed dimmer, weaker, as though even the gods themselves hesitated to cast their light on this place. Heracles stood at the edge of the wood, his muscles taut, his grip firm around the gnarled club he had fashioned from an olive tree. His breaths came steady, but his heart beat like a war drum. Somewhere in the shadows, it waited, a beast unlike any other, born of savagery and darkness. The villagers had spoken of it in trembling whispers, their voices tinged with fear and disbelief. The Nemean lion was no ordinary predator. Its hide was said to be impenetrable, its claws sharper than the finest blade. It had ravaged their homes, tearing through livestock and men alike as if they were no more than blades of grass in its path. They had begged for salvation, their hope pinned on Heracles, the son of Zeus, the man who was more than a man. Heracles took a step into the forest, the sound of his footfall swallowed by the oppressive silence. Each step was deliberate, calculated, as he moved deeper into the lion's domain. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches reaching like skeletal hands. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, every nerve in his body on edge. The lion was watching him, he could feel it. Its presence was a weight, a predator's patience biding its time. A rustle in the underbrush broke the silence. Heracles froze, his grip tightening on the club. Then it appeared, a hulking mass of muscle and golden fur, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The lion stepped into the clearing, its movements impossibly fluid, its head low, lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed teeth as white and sharp as ivory daggers. It was a thing of nightmares, a creature that defied nature itself. For a moment, they stood there, man and beast, locked in a deadly standoff. Heracles could see the intelligence in its gaze, the way it studied him, assessing his every move. The lion let out a roar that shook the very ground, a sound so primal and full of fury that it seemed to tear through Heracles' chest. But he did not flinch. Fear was a luxury he could not afford. The lion lunged, its massive body a blur of speed and power. Heracles dodged, the beast's claws slicing through the air inches from his face. He swung his club, the force of the blow reverberating through his arms as it struck the lion's side. But the weapon splintered against its hide, the wood falling to the ground in useless shards. The lion turned on him, its growl low and menacing, its eyes filled with the promise of death. Heracles realized then that brute strength would not be enough. The lion was more than a foe, it was a challenge, a test of his wit as much as his might. He had to outthink it, outmaneuver it. The beast charged again, its claws extended, but this time Heracles was ready. He sidestepped at the last moment, his hand darting out to grab a fistful of its mane. With a roar of his own, he wrestled the lion to the ground, his arms straining as he grappled with the monstrous creature. The struggle was a clash of wills, the forest echoing with the sounds of their battle. The lion thrashed, its claws raking across Heracles' flesh, drawing blood. But he held on, his grip unyielding. Pain seared through him, but it only fueled his determination. He wrapped his arms around the lion's neck, his muscles bulging as he applied pressure. The beast snarled and writhed, its strength almost overwhelming. But Heracles was a force unto himself, a storm of resolve and fury. Minutes felt like hours as the fight raged on. Sweat dripped from Heracles' brow, mixing with the blood that stained his skin. His vision blurred, his breath ragged, but he refused to let go. The lion's struggles began to weaken, its roars fading into a pitiful growl. With one final surge of strength, Heracles tightened his grip, and the beast went limp. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Heracles released his hold, his body collapsing beside the lifeless lion. He lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, his mind reeling from the intensity of what had just transpired. The Nemean lion, the terror of the forest, was no more. Heracles rose slowly, his body aching but his spirit triumphant. He stared at the lion's massive form, a mixture of awe and respect in his eyes. This creature, this force of nature, had tested him in ways he had never been tested before. And though he had emerged victorious, the victory felt more like a transformation, a shedding of the man he had been, and the birth of the hero he was destined to become. He knelt beside the lion and began to skin it, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that weighed on him. The hide, as tough as the legends had said, would become his armor, a symbol of his strength and his first labor. As he worked, the forest seemed to breathe again, the oppressive silence lifting, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. The sun broke through the canopy, its rays illuminating the clearing in a golden light. Heracles stood, the lion's hide draped over his shoulders, his silhouette a testament to the triumph of courage and perseverance. He took one last look at the forest, at the place where he had faced his fears and emerged stronger. Then, with steady steps, he walked away, leaving behind the shadows and stepping into the light. The swamp reeked of decay, a suffocating stench that clung to the air like a warning. The waters bubbled ominously, black and thick like ink. Heracles stood at the edge, his face a mask of determination. Somewhere within the murky depths lay his next challenge, a creature born of nightmares, its name whispered with fear even among the gods. The Hydra. The sky above was heavy with dark clouds, and the distant rumble of thunder seemed to echo the tension in Heracles' heart. He gripped his sword tightly, the blade gleaming even in the dim light. He wasn't just battling a beast, he was confronting the impossible. The Hydra was no ordinary monster, it was a multi-headed serpent, each head a venomous threat, and worse, for every head severed, two more would take its place. A monster that grew stronger as it was wounded. A low, guttural hiss pierced the silence, sending a chill racing down Heracles' spine. The water rippled violently, and then it rose. The Hydra emerged, its massive body coiled and writhing, its 9 heads twisting and snapping, each with jaws that could crush a man in an instant. Its eyes glowed with malice, and the very sight of it was enough to freeze the bravest of warriors. But Heracles stood firm. The first head lunged with terrifying speed, its fangs dripping with venom that sizzled as it hit the ground. Heracles dodged, rolling to the side, his sword slicing through the air. The blade met its mark, severing the head cleanly. For a moment, there was a glimmer of triumph, but it was short-lived. From the stump, 2 new heads sprouted, hissing and snapping with renewed fury. Heracles cursed under his breath. He had expected this, but seeing it happen was another matter entirely. The Hydra attacked again, its heads moving in perfect, deadly coordination. Heracles fought with everything he had, his sword flashing as he deflected one strike after another. The ground beneath him grew slick with venom, the air thick with the creature's roars. Each head he cut down was replaced by 2 more, the beast growing stronger, its fury more intense. It was a battle not just against the Hydra, but against despair itself. Heracles' muscles burned, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, but he refused to give up. He was no ordinary man, he was a son of Zeus, a warrior forged by trials and pain. He knew he couldn't win this fight with brute strength alone. He needed a plan, a way to stop the Hydra's relentless regeneration. He retreated, his mind racing even as the Hydra advanced, its head striking like lightning. Then, inspiration struck. Fire. Fire was the answer. He called out to his loyal companion, Iolaus, who had been watching from a safe distance. Without hesitation, Iolaus sprang into action, grabbing a torch and lighting it with the dry kindling they had prepared. Heracles felt a surge of hope. If they could cauterize the necks before the heads regenerated, they might just have a chance. The next time a head lunged, Heracles swung his sword with precision, severing it cleanly. Now, he shouted, and Iolaus rushed forward, pressing the flaming torch to the wound. The stench of burning flesh filled the air, and for the first time, the Hydra recoiled, its writhing heads twisting in pain. The neck remained cauterized, no new head sprouted. Heracles' heart pounded with renewed determination. He fought with a ferocity born of desperation and resolve, his blade slicing through the Hydra's necks, each strike followed by Iolaus' torch. One by one, the heads fell, and the creature's roars grew weaker, its massive body writhing in agony. But the Hydra was not done yet. Its central head, larger and more menacing than the others, struck with the speed of a viper, nearly catching Heracles off guard. He stumbled back, narrowly avoiding the lethal fangs. This head was different, immortal, they had said, unkillable. Heracles gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He needed more than fire to end this once and for all. Summoning every ounce of his strength, Heracles lunged forward, his sword meeting the Hydra's central head in a clash of steel and scales. The beast thrashed violently, its tail smashing into the ground with earth-shaking force. Heracles pressed on, his muscles screaming as he drove the blade deeper. With a final, defiant roar, he severed the head, grabbing it before it could regenerate. He turned to Iolaus, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. Working quickly, they buried the immortal head beneath a massive boulder, trapping it forever. The Hydra's body writhed one last time before falling still, the swamp finally falling silent. Heracles stood there, his chest heaving, his body battered but victorious. The swamp, once a place of fear and darkness, now seemed oddly serene. The Hydra, the impossible beast, lay defeated. He had done what others had deemed unthinkable, not through sheer might alone, but through courage, wit, and the unwavering support of a loyal ally. The air was heavy with the scent of blood and ash, but Heracles felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He turned to Iolaus, a faint smile breaking through his exhaustion. Together, they had faced the impossible and won. But Heracles knew this was just one labor among many. The path ahead would be no easier. Still, in this moment, he allowed himself a breath of relief, a flicker of pride. The morning sun burned through a haze of mist as Heracles and Theseus stood on the hilltop, gazing across the vast plain below. The rhythmic sound of marching filled the air, steady and unyielding. The Amazons, fierce warrior women with hearts as unbreakable as their shields, advanced in perfect formation. Their banners fluttered like ominous omens in the wind, and the glint of their bronze armor caught the sunlight in bursts that seemed almost alive. Each warrior held her head high, their eyes sharp, their movements calculated. This was no ordinary battle, it was a clash of two forces destined to collide. Heracles tightened his grip on his club, the knotted wood feeling like an extension of his own strength. Beside him, Theseus adjusted the sword at his side, his expression a mix of resolve and unease. The Amazons were not like the beasts Heracles had fought before. They were not mindless creatures driven by instinct. They were humans, strategic, intelligent, and unrelenting in their pursuit of victory. And yet, Heracles could sense the tension in the air, a silent hum that promised blood and glory. The battle began with a thunderous charge. The Amazons moved with a ferocity that was both beautiful and terrifying, their war cries piercing the sky. Their queen, Hippolyta, led them, her presence commanding and unyielding. She was a force of nature, her armor adorned with symbols of her power, her spear gleaming as if it held the sun itself. Heracles could not help but feel a flicker of admiration for her, even as he prepared to meet her forces head-on. The first clash was deafening. Heracles swung his club with the force of a mountain, scattering warriors like leaves in a storm. But for every Amazon that fell, two more stepped forward, their blades flashing like lightning. Theseus fought at his side, his movements swift and precise, a blur of calculated strikes and dodges. The air filled with the sound of clashing metal, the cries of the wounded, and the relentless drumbeat of war. Hippolyta's gaze locked onto Heracles, and in that instant, the chaos around them seemed to fade. She charged toward him, her spear aimed with deadly precision. Heracles met her strike with his club, the impact reverberating through his arms. She was fast, faster than any opponent he had faced before, and her strikes came with a precision that left little room for error. Their battle was a dance of strength and skill, each move countered, each strike met with equal force. As they fought, Heracles could feel the weight of her determination. This was not just a fight for her, it was a stand for her people, her honor, her very existence. And though Heracles was no stranger to combat, he found himself pushed to his limits, his every move met with resistance that seemed almost otherworldly. Nearby, Theseus faced an Amazon warrior whose blade moved like a serpent, striking with speed and cunning. He parried her attacks, his breathing steady despite the strain. She fought with a grace that was almost hypnotic, her movements fluid and unpredictable. But Theseus was no novice. He found his opening, his blade slicing through her defenses, and she fell with a cry that echoed in his ears. The battle raged on, the plain becoming a sea of chaos. The Amazons fought with a unity that was both inspiring and devastating. They were not just warriors, they were sisters, fighting for each other, for their queen, for their way of life. Heracles could feel the weight of that bond, and it fueled his resolve. He was not fighting out of hatred or greed, he fought because he had to. Because the gods had demanded it. Because destiny had placed him here. But destiny was cruel. As the sun climbed higher, its heat searing the battlefield, the tide began to turn. Heracles and Theseus pressed forward, their strength and strategy overpowering even the Amazons' formidable unity. Hippolyta's spear was knocked from her grasp, and Heracles saw the momentary flicker of defeat in her eyes. Yet, even as she fell, there was no fear, no surrender. She was a queen, proud and unyielding to the end. The plain fell silent as the last of the Amazons retreated, their cries fading into the distance. Heracles stood amidst the wreckage of the battlefield, his chest heaving, his body bruised but unbroken. The weight of the battle hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the lives lost, the strength tested, and the bonds shattered. Theseus approached, his face streaked with blood and dirt, his eyes weary but resolute. They shared a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of what they had endured. The Amazons had fought with a ferocity that neither of them would forget, their courage etched into the very fabric of the day. Heracles glanced toward the horizon, where the remnants of the Amazon army disappeared into the distance. He could not help but feel a pang of respect for them, for the way they had stood against the odds, unyielding even in the face of overwhelming force. It was a battle that would linger in his mind, not just for its brutality, but for the honor and determination of those who had fought on both sides. The cave loomed ahead, a black maw swallowing all light. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness, as if the world itself dared not breathe in the presence of what lay within. Perseus stood at its entrance, his heart pounding against his chest like a war drum. The weight of the task ahead pressed down on him, suffocating and unrelenting. In his hand, he gripped the polished bronze shield gifted to him by Athena, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. At his side hung a blade forged by Hephaestus, sharp enough to slice through the toughest scales. These were no ordinary weapons, for Perseus was no ordinary man. He was stepping into the realm of a monster. Medusa. The very name was enough to chill the blood of the bravest warriors. Once a maiden of unmatched beauty, cursed by the gods themselves, she had become a symbol of terror. Her hair writhed with living serpents, their hissing a warning to any who dared approach. Her eyes, it was said, could turn flesh and bone to stone with a single glance. The fields outside the cave bore silent testimony to her power, statues frozen in poses of terror, their faces twisted in agony. They were not art, They were victims. Perseus took a step forward, then another, the sound of his sandals on the rocky ground echoing faintly in the suffocating silence. The cave swallowed him whole, darkness enveloping him. He moved cautiously, his breath shallow, every sense heightened. The shield in his hand trembled slightly, and he tightened his grip, reminding himself of Athena's instructions. Do not meet her gaze. Trust in the shield. The air inside the cave was colder, damp with the scent of decay. It was not just the home of a monster, it was a graveyard. Perseus could feel the weight of countless eyes watching him, though he knew they were not alive. He dared not look directly, but the edges of his vision caught glimpses of statues, warriors frozen mid-swing, hunters reaching for their bows, faces forever locked in expressions of desperation. They had all come with the same purpose, and they had all failed. A sound broke the stillness, a soft rustling like dry leaves scraping against stone. Perseus froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his blade. The sound grew louder, closer, and then he heard it, the unmistakable hiss of serpents. His pulse quickened, every muscle in his body tense. She was near. The rustling stopped, replaced by a low, almost musical voice. Another fool come to claim glory, Medusa said, her words dripping with disdain. Another lamb for the slaughter. Her voice echoed off the walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Perseus did not answer. He knew better than to engage her with words. She was not just a creature of might but of cunning, and he could not afford to give her any advantage. He raised the shield, angling it carefully, its reflective surface becoming his eyes. He moved slowly, methodically, scanning the cave through the distorted image it offered. And then he saw her. She moved with a sinuous grace, her serpentine hair writhing as if each strand had a mind of its own. Her skin glowed faintly in the darkness, a sickly, otherworldly sheen. She was both monstrous and mesmerizing, a creature that seemed to defy the natural order. Perseus's grip on his sword tightened. He could not afford to hesitate. Medusa prowled closer, her movements eerily silent except for the occasional hiss of her serpents. She was hunting him, savoring the moment, drawing out the inevitable. Perseus forced himself to stay calm, his eyes fixed on the shield. He waited until she was close enough, her reflection sharp and clear in the polished bronze. His heart pounded in his ears, but his hands were steady. And then he struck. The blade flashed in the dim light, a blur of motion aimed with precision born of desperation and divine guidance. Medusa's scream was not human, it was a sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the cave, a sound of fury and agony that pierced Perseus to his core. He did not stop. He could not stop. He swung again, the blade finding its mark, and the terrible noise ceased as suddenly as it had begun. Silence fell over the cave once more, heavier and more oppressive than before. Perseus stood still, his chest heaving, his grip on the blade unyielding. He did not look down. He did not need to. The shield reflected the lifeless form of Medusa, her head severed, her serpents still writhing in their final moments. Carefully, reverently, Perseus placed the head into a sack made for this purpose. He did not linger. The cave felt alive with unseen eyes, and he could not shake the feeling that the statues around him were watching, waiting. As he stepped back into the light of day, the weight of what he had done began to sink in. He had faced the impossible and survived, but he felt no triumph, no joy. Only a heavy, aching weariness. The field of statues seemed different now, their frozen forms a stark reminder of the price of hubris and the fragility of mortal life. Perseus walked among them, his steps slow, his gaze steady. He had done what they could not, but at what cost? The sack at his side felt heavier with each step, its contents a symbol of his victory and a curse all its own. Perseus did not look back. He could not. The road ahead was long, and the burden he carried was far greater than the weight of a single head. He had slain the monster, but the memory of her scream, the feel of her lifeblood on his hands, would haunt him forever. The sea churned angrily beneath the Argo, waves crashing against the sturdy wooden hull with relentless fury. The sky above was a dark canvas, split by jagged streaks of lightning. Jason gripped the ship's mast tightly, his knuckles white with tension. Around him, the Argonauts, warriors, heroes, and demigods, fought to keep the vessel steady, their muscles straining against the wind and rain. But the storm was not their only enemy. From the depths of the roiling sea came an unearthly roar, a sound so guttural and primal it seemed to rise from the very heart of the ocean. The Argonauts froze for a moment, their eyes scanning the darkness. Then they saw it, a monstrous shadow beneath the waves, its outline blurred but massive. The water swirled violently as the beast emerged, a towering serpent with eyes that burned like molten gold and scales that glistened like whetstone. This was Scylla, the terror of sailors, and she had marked the Argo as her prey. Panic threatened to overtake the crew, but Jason's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Hold your ground," he shouted, his words laced with both urgency and defiance. He turned to Heracles, the strongest among them, and gestured toward the beast. "Prepare to strike when it comes close." Heracles nodded, his massive frame braced against the ship's movement. He lifted a harpoon, its iron tip gleaming despite the gloom. The others scrambled to their positions, each man's heart pounding with fear and determination. They were the Argonauts, chosen for their courage and skill, but against a creature like Scylla, even legends could falter. The serpent lunged, its jaws snapping at the Argo with terrifying speed. The ship rocked violently, sending some of the crew sprawling. Heracles let out a roar of his own and hurled the harpoon with all his might. The weapon flew true, embedding itself in the creature's side. Scylla shrieked in pain, the sound reverberating through the storm. Blood, dark and viscous, poured into the sea, but the beast was far from defeated. Jason barked orders, his mind racing to outmaneuver the monster. Orpheus, the musician whose songs could tame even the wildest hearts, began to play his lyre, the haunting melody cutting through the storm like a beacon. The music seemed to confuse Scylla, her movements slowing as if caught in a trance. Taking advantage of the moment, the Argonauts rallied, hurling spears and arrows with unrelenting precision. The beast thrashed, its tail smashing into the ship and splintering wood, but it was weakening. Finally, with a final bellow of rage, Scylla retreated into the depths, leaving the Argonauts battered but alive. The crew collapsed onto the deck, their breaths ragged, their bodies trembling. The storm began to abate, the skies clearing as if the gods themselves were offering a reprieve. Jason looked at his comrades, their faces pale but resolute. They had survived, but the journey was far from over. Their voyage was a tapestry of trials, each more harrowing than the last. At the edge of a dark forest, they encountered the Harpies, vile creatures with the faces of women and the bodies of birds, their shrieks a torment to the soul. The Harpies descended upon the Argonauts with razor-sharp talons, their eyes filled with malice. It was Phineus, the blind prophet they had come to aid, who guided them. "Strike swiftly, but beware their cunning," he warned. With the help of the winged sons of Boreas, the Argonauts managed to drive the Harpies away. The creatures fled into the sky, their cries fading into the distance, leaving behind a sense of uneasy victory. Phineus, grateful for their help, revealed a secret path to them, one that would lead them closer to their goal, but not without its own dangers. The clashing rocks were the next test, a narrow strait where massive boulders smashed together with relentless force, obliterating anything caught in their grip. The Argonauts stared at the churning waters, their faces shadowed with doubt. Jason turned to Athena, who had been their silent guide, her wisdom a beacon in the darkest moments. She instructed them to release a dove to gauge the timing of the rocks. The bird flew, darting through the gap with barely a moment to spare, its tail feathers clipped by the closing stones. "Now!" Jason shouted, and the Argonauts rowed with every ounce of strength they possessed. The Argo surged forward, the roar of the rocks deafening. Splinters flew as the edges of the ship scraped against the stones, but they made it through. Cheers erupted from the crew, their joy tempered by the knowledge that their true objective still lay ahead. The Colchian shore was their destination, and the Golden Fleece their prize. But before they could claim it, they faced the might of Aedes, the king of Colchis, and his trials designed to break even the bravest of souls. Jason, with the aid of Medea, a sorceress torn between loyalty to her father and her love for the hero, was tasked with yoking fire-breathing bulls and sowing the teeth of a dragon into the earth. From those teeth sprang warriors, fierce and unyielding, their eyes glowing with malice. Jason fought with the cunning Medea had whispered to him in the dark of night, using strategy rather than brute force. He hurled a stone among the warriors, turning them against one another in their confusion. The battle was brief but brutal, and when the dust settled, Jason stood victorious. Yet the greatest challenge awaited them, the dragon that guarded the golden fleece. Its body coiled around the sacred tree, its eyes burning with eternal vigilance. Medea, with her spells and soft words, lulled the beast into sleep, allowing Jason to approach. He seized the fleece, its golden threads shimmering with otherworldly light, a symbol of triumph hard won. The Argonauts returned to their ship, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had endured. They had faced monsters, storms, and the very wrath of the gods. Each man bore scars, visible and unseen, reminders of a journey that would echo through the ages. They were not the same men who had set sail, but they had achieved what many would have deemed impossible. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the distant echo of water dripping from unseen cracks in the stone walls. The labyrinth stretched endlessly before Theseus, its narrow corridors twisting and turning in maddening ways. The dim torchlight cast eerie shadows, flickering as if mocking his courage. He gripped the sword tightly, its weight reassuring in his hand, and glanced at the golden thread trailing behind him. Ariadne's thread, a fragile lifeline in a place designed to devour all hope. Each step felt heavier than the last, the oppressive atmosphere gnawing at his resolve. The stories whispered in hushed tones about the Minotaur, the beast that waited at the heart of this maze, filled his mind. Half man, half bull, a creature born of rage and cursed by fate. This was no mere monster, it was a living embodiment of terror, bred to destroy. And now Theseus was here, not just to face it, but to kill it. A low growl rolled through the labyrinth, reverberating off the stone walls. It was deep, guttural, and filled with a menace that sent shivers down his spine. He stopped, straining his ears. The growl came again, closer this time, a sound that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Theseus tightened his grip on the sword and took a slow, deliberate breath. Fear was a poison he couldn't afford. He moved forward, his steps cautious but steady. The labyrinth played tricks on his senses, each turn indistinguishable from the last. The air grew warmer, carrying with it a faint, rancid odor. Theseus' heartbeat quickened. He wasn't alone anymore. The growl turned into a snort, followed by the heavy thud of hooves. It was rhythmic, deliberate, as if the beast was toying with him, savoring his approach. Theseus rounded a corner and froze. There, standing at the end of the corridor, was the Minotaur. The creature's massive frame filled the narrow passage, its muscular body gleaming with sweat under the faint light. Its head was that of a bull, with sharp, curved horns that could skewer a man in a heartbeat. Its eyes glowed with a primal fury, locking onto Theseus with an intensity that was almost unbearable. The Minotaur let out a deafening roar, a sound that shook the very ground beneath him, and charged. Theseus braced himself, the adrenaline surging through his veins. The beast was fast, far faster than he had expected. He sidestepped at the last moment, the Minotaur's horns narrowly missing him. The creature skidded to a halt and turned, its breath heavy, nostrils flaring. It pawed the ground like a bull preparing for another charge, and Theseus knew this was no ordinary foe. Strength alone would not save him. The fight began in earnest, a brutal dance of predator and prey. The Minotaur's strength was overwhelming, each swipe of its claws sent sparks flying as they struck the stone walls. Theseus used his agility, dodging and weaving, his sword slicing through the air as he aimed for the beast's vulnerable spots. But the Minotaur was cunning, its movements unpredictable. Every missed strike brought Theseus closer to exhaustion, and every roar from the beast sent waves of fear crashing through him. Blood spattered the walls as the fight wore on, a mix of human and beast. Theseus' muscles burned, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The labyrinth seemed to close in around him, amplifying the Minotaur's growls and his own desperate thoughts. He couldn't keep this up. Not like this. Then, in the chaos of the battle, a memory surfaced, Ariadne's voice, soft and steady, guiding him as they had planned. "Use its strength against it," she had said, her eyes filled with both fear and hope. "It is relentless, but that will be its downfall." Theseus steadied himself, forcing his mind to clear. He studied the Minotaur, its movements, its rage. The beast charged again, its horns aimed straight for his chest. This time, Theseus didn't dodge. He stood firm, waiting until the last possible moment. Then, with a swift sidestep, he drove his sword upward, into the beast's exposed side. The Minotaur let out a guttural roar, its massive body convulsing with pain. But it didn't fall. It turned to face him, blood dripping from its wound, its fury now a blazing inferno. Theseus gritted his teeth. The beast was wounded, but far from defeated. The fight dragged on, each clash of sword and claw more desperate than the last. Theseus felt his strength waning, his vision blurring. But he refused to give in. With a final burst of energy, he feigned weakness, letting the Minotaur believe it had the upper hand. The beast lunged, its massive form barreling toward him with terrifying speed. Theseus sidestepped once more, this time plunging his sword deep into the creature's chest. The Minotaur staggered, its roar fading into a guttural groan. It fell to its knees, its massive body trembling as life ebbed away. For a moment, it looked almost human, its eyes filled with something that resembled sorrow, or perhaps relief. Then it collapsed, the labyrinth finally silent. Theseus stood over the fallen beast, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion. The golden thread glimmered faintly in the torchlight, a reminder of the way out. He turned and began to follow it, his footsteps heavy, the weight of what he had done settling on his shoulders. The labyrinth no longer seemed as menacing, but the echoes of the battle lingered, a haunting reminder of the monster he had slain, and the cost of his victory. The night was heavy with an air of foreboding. The stars shone dimly over the kingdom of Colchis, their light swallowed by the darkness of the task ahead. Jason stood before the king, Eats, whose piercing gaze bore down on him like a predator studying its prey. The golden fleece, an artifact of untold power and beauty, hung within reach, yet it might as well have been a world away. Eats did not hide his disdain, his lips curling into a cold smile. "If you desire the fleece," the king said, his voice laced with menace, "you will earn it." The conditions were impossible. Jason had to yoke a pair of fire-breathing bulls and plow a field with them. Then, he was to sow the teeth of a dragon into the soil and face whatever horrors sprouted from them. Eats was certain the foreigner would fail, but Jason refused to falter. The weight of his quest pressed against him, but so did the presence of Medea, the king's daughter. Her dark eyes flickered with something he couldn't place, curiosity, perhaps even sympathy. The next morning, the air shimmered with heat as the bulls were brought forth. Their hulking forms were a nightmare given life. Flames snorted from their nostrils, licking the air in defiance, their iron hooves striking the earth with enough force to send tremors through the ground. Jason's heart thundered in his chest, but he stepped forward with calm determination. Every fiber of his being screamed to run, but he had not crossed seas and endured countless perils to falter now. From the shadows, Medea watched. Her hands trembled as she clutched the vial of potion she had prepared. It was a gift of protection, a secret act of betrayal against her father. As Jason approached the bulls, she caught his eye for the briefest moment and nodded. He understood. The potion's magic surged through his veins, shielding him from the searing heat. Yet even with this aid, the task was monumental. The bulls roared in fury, their massive forms thrashing wildly. Jason's muscles strained as he fought to control them, his hands blistering against the ropes. Every moment was a battle of wills, man against beast, mortal against the impossible. The ground burned beneath him, but he held firm, his focus unyielding. Slowly, painfully, he yoked them together, their fiery protests echoing across the field. Eats watched from his throne, his expression unreadable. Jason had succeeded in the first task, but the hardest was yet to come. The field stretched out before him, its soil dark and lifeless. Jason gripped the bag of dragon teeth, their jagged edges glinting in the sunlight. He cast them into the earth, each one disappearing into the soil like a seed of malice. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ground began to shudder. First, skeletal fingers broke through the dirt, clawing at the open air. One by one, warriors rose from the soil, fully armed and clad in armor. Their hollow eyes burned with an unholy light, and they moved as one, their weapons gleaming with intent. Jason's breath hitched. These were not men, they were monsters, born of ancient magic, and they advanced toward him with deadly precision. Medea's voice rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the chaos. "Throw a stone among them," she cried. Jason didn't question her. He snatched a rock from the ground and hurled it into their midst. The warriors froze, their glowing eyes flickering as they turned on each other. Confusion gave way to violence, and they began to fight amongst themselves, their swords clashing in a cacophony of chaos. Jason stood back, his chest heaving, as the earthborn soldiers tore each other apart. Dust and blood filled the air, and when the frenzy finally ended, the field was silent once more. Broken bodies littered the ground, and Jason remained standing, victorious yet exhausted. Each rose from his throne, his face dark with fury. He had not expected the young hero to succeed, and now, the balance of power was slipping from his grasp. But the ordeal was not over. The golden fleece still hung in the sacred grove, guarded by a dragon whose coiled body wrapped around the treasure like an impenetrable wall. Jason approached the grove, his steps cautious, his sword ready. The dragon's eyes glowed in the shadows, its scales glinting like molten gold. It hissed, a sound that cut through the air like a blade, and uncoiled itself to face him. Jason felt the weight of its gaze, its ancient power radiating like a storm. The dragon struck with blinding speed, its jaws snapping inches from him. He dodged, rolling to the side, his heart pounding. Every movement was a test of survival, every breath a gamble. His sword found its mark once, twice, but the dragon's hide was impenetrable. Desperation clawed at him as he fought, each strike seeming more futile than the last. Then, a shadow moved in the grove. Medea appeared, her face pale but resolute. She raised her hands, chanting words in an ancient tongue. The dragon hesitated, its eyes flickering with confusion. Medea's magic wrapped around it like chains, and slowly, the beast began to falter. It swayed, its movements sluggish, until finally, it collapsed into a deep, unnatural sleep. Jason stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached for the fleece. It was warm to the touch, its golden threads shimmering with a light that seemed to come from another world. He turned to Medea, their eyes meeting in a moment of unspoken understanding. She had risked everything to help him, betraying her father and her people. And now, together, they would face whatever came next. The cave was dark and damp, the air heavy with the stench of animals and old blood. Odysseus stood still, his men gathered nervously around him, their eyes darting to the massive boulder that blocked the entrance. There was no way out, no escape. Their captor was no ordinary beast, but a towering cyclops named Polyphemus, his single eye burning like a cursed star in his monstrous face. Outside, the cries of their shipmates had faded into silence, and the only sound left was the slow, guttural breathing of the giant as he prepared for the night ahead. Polyphemus loomed over them, his voice a thunderous roar that made the walls of the cave tremble. "You dare to trespass on my land," he bellowed, his words dripping with malice. He grabbed two of Odysseus's men with terrifying ease, their screams echoing as he smashed them against the rocks. The Cyclops devoured them as if they were nothing more than a meal, their lives extinguished in moments. The men could only watch in horror, their own fate looming over them like a dark shadow. Odysseus clenched his fists, his mind racing. Panic would get them nowhere, but Polyphemus was too powerful to face head-on. He needed a plan, a way to outwit a creature whose brute strength could crush them all in seconds. He forced himself to breathe, to think. The Cyclops had underestimated him, had underestimated the cunning of a man who had survived countless trials. And Odysseus would make him regret it. When Polyphemus finally laid down to sleep, his snores rattling through the cave like distant thunder, Odysseus gathered his men close. "We can't overpower him," he whispered, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his chest. "But we can blind him." He pointed to a massive wooden stake lying near the fire, its end charred and sharp. The men exchanged uneasy glances but nodded. There was no other choice. Morning came, and Polyphemus rose with a hunger that chilled their bones. He grabbed 2 more men and devoured them without hesitation, his laughter filling the cave as if mocking their helplessness. Odysseus stepped forward, his face calm, his voice steady. "Great Polyphemus," he said, "we are but humble travelers seeking your hospitality. Allow us to offer you wine, a gift from far-off lands." The Cyclops eyed him suspiciously but took the wineskin. He drank deeply, the rich red liquid staining his lips. It was stronger than anything he'd tasted before, and soon, his movements grew sluggish, his words slurred. "What is your name, little man?" he asked, his voice heavy with the effects of the wine. Odysseus smiled faintly. "My name is Nobody." Polyphemus laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that shook the walls. "Nobody? Then I shall eat you last, Nobody." With that, he collapsed into a drunken stupor, his massive body sprawled across the cave floor. This was their chance. Odysseus and his men heaved the stake into the fire, its tip glowing red-hot as it caught the flames. Sweat dripped down their faces as they lifted it together, their breaths labored but determined. They moved as one, their fear swallowed by desperation. With a single, mighty thrust, they drove the stake into the Cyclops' eye. The scream that followed was inhuman, a sound of pure agony that seemed to split the heavens. Polyphemus thrashed wildly, his massive hands clawing at his face as blood and fire poured from his ruined eye. "Nobody," he roared, his voice shaking the earth. "Nobody has blinded me." Outside, other Cyclopes heard his cries and called to him. "Who is hurting you, Polyphemus?" "Nobody," he shouted back. "Nobody is attacking me." And so, they left him, dismissing his torment as the ramblings of madness. Blinded and enraged, Polyphemus stumbled around the cave, his hands groping for the men he could no longer see. Odysseus and his crew moved with silent precision, their breaths shallow as they dodged his sweeping arms. They knew their time was limited. The boulders still blocked the entrance, and Polyphemus's strength could still end them in an instant. Odysseus's mind worked quickly. He turned to the flock of sheep huddled in the corner, their woolly bodies trembling in fear. One by one, he tied his men beneath the sheep, securing them tightly so they would blend in when the flock was let out to graze. The men hesitated, their eyes wide with doubt, but Odysseus's resolve was unshakable. "Trust me," he said, his voice firm. "This will work." Morning came, and Polyphemus, still blinded and groaning in pain, unblocked the cave's entrance to release his flock. He ran his massive hands over their backs, ensuring no man tried to escape. But Odysseus's plan held. The men clung tightly to the undersides of the sheep, their hearts pounding as they passed beneath the Cyclops' touch. One by one, they slipped out, the sunlight hitting their faces like a blessing. Odysseus was the last to go, clutching the underside of the largest ram. Polyphemus paused as the ram passed, his hands lingering. "Why do you lag behind, my favorite?" he murmured, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Do you mourn my pain, my blindness? If only you could speak and tell me where those cursed men have gone." Odysseus held his breath, his body tense. The Cyclops finally let the ram pass, and Odysseus emerged into the open air. His men waited for him near the ship, their faces alight with relief and disbelief. Together, they pushed the vessel into the water, their hands working with desperate urgency. As the ship sailed away, Odysseus could not resist one final act of defiance. He turned to the island and shouted, "Polyphemus! It was not Nobody who blinded you, it was I, Odysseus of Ithaca." The Cyclops roared in fury, hurling massive boulders toward the sound of his voice. The sea churned, the waves rising violently, but the ship remained just out of reach. Polyphemus called upon his father, Poseidon, to curse the man who had wronged him. The sea god would hear his son's cries, and Odysseus's journey home would be plagued with trials yet to come. For now, though, they were free. Exhausted but alive, Odysseus and his men sailed into the horizon, the Cyclops' island shrinking into the distance. The victory was hard-won, a testament to the hero's cunning and courage in the face of impossible odds. The sky split open with a deafening roar, thunder rolling like the drums of war. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension, every breath heavy with the promise of chaos. On one side stood Zeus, the king of the gods, his mighty hand clutching a lightning bolt that glowed brighter than the sun. Across the scorched earth loomed Typhon, a monstrous being so vast and terrible that the ground trembled beneath his weight. His 100 dragon heads hissed and spat fire, their eyes burning with hatred. The fate of Olympus hung in the balance, the heavens trembling under the weight of their impending clash. Typhon's voice was a cacophony, a terrible symphony of growls, hisses, and roars that echoed across the land. "Zeus," he thundered, his words shaking the mountains. "You dare to challenge me? You, the so-called king, who hides behind your throne while your people cower in fear." Zeus's face was a mask of resolve, his eyes blazing with defiance. "I do not hide, Typhon. I fight for Olympus, for the world you seek to destroy. Your reign of terror ends here." The earth beneath them cracked and groaned as Typhon surged forward, his massive claws ripping through the landscape. Each step left craters in the ground, black smoke rising from his fiery breath. Zeus braced himself, his lightning bolt sparking with raw energy. With a mighty throw, he unleashed the first strike, the bolt slicing through the air with a sound like the sky itself being torn apart. The lightning struck Typhon square in the chest, and for a moment, it seemed the battle might end before it began. But the monster merely laughed, the sound chilling and otherworldly. He shrugged off the attack as if it were nothing more than a fleeting gust of wind. "Is that all, king of the gods?" he sneered. "I expected more from you." Zeus narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening. This was no ordinary foe. Typhon was chaos incarnate, a creature born of primordial hatred and destruction. Zeus summoned another bolt, then another, each one more powerful than the last. The sky lit up with an unrelenting barrage of lightning, each strike illuminating the battlefield in blinding flashes. Typhon retaliated with a fury that defied comprehension. Flames erupted from his many mouths, torrents of fire scorching everything in their path. His claws slashed through the air, sending shockwaves that flattened forests and shattered mountains. Zeus dodged and countered with the precision of a warrior, his movements a blur of strength and speed. But Typhon's sheer size and power were overwhelming, a force of nature that could not be contained. The battle raged on, neither side willing to yield. The heavens darkened, clouds swirling like a vortex of despair. The winds howled, carrying with them the cries of the gods who watched in horror from Olympus. Typhon reached out with one massive hand, claws extended, and grabbed Zeus. The king of the gods struggled against the monster's crushing grip, his strength tested to its limits. "You are weak, Zeus," Typhon spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You and your kind are relics of a dying age. I will tear down your precious Olympus and remake the world in my image." But Zeus was not one to be defeated so easily. Summoning every ounce of his strength, he called upon the power of the heavens. The clouds parted, revealing a sky ablaze with light. With a thunderous roar, Zeus unleashed the mightiest bolt yet, a weapon forged in the heart of creation itself. The lightning struck Typhon with such force that the earth beneath them split open, a chasm of molten rock swallowing the monster's lower half. Typhon howled in agony, his head thrashing wildly as the searing pain coursed through his massive body. Yet, even in his suffering, his defiance burned bright. He lunged at Zeus with a final, desperate attack, his claws aiming for the god's heart. Zeus met the charge head-on, his own roar echoing across the battlefield. Lightning and fire collided in an explosion of light and sound, the shockwave flattening everything for miles. When the dust settled, Zeus stood victorious, his chest heaving, his body battered but unbroken. Typhon lay defeated, his massive form sprawled across the shattered landscape. The monster's fiery eyes dimmed, his 100 heads falling silent one by one. The earth seemed to sigh with relief, the winds calming, the skies clearing. Zeus raised his hand, summoning one final bolt. He drove it into the heart of Typhon, sealing the monster beneath the earth for all eternity. The ground closed over him, the scars of their battle etched into the land as a reminder of the gods' triumph over chaos. As the skies cleared, the gods of Olympus descended, their faces a mix of awe and relief. Zeus stood tall, his lightning bolt still crackling with energy, his eyes scanning the horizon. The battle was won, but the cost had been great. The land bore the scars of their clash, and the memory of Typhon's fury would linger for generations. But Zeus had proven that even in the face of unimaginable power, courage and determination could prevail. And as the sun broke through the clouds, its golden light bathing the battlefield, the king of the gods turned toward Olympus, his resolve stronger than ever. The air was thick with a foreboding stillness, as if the earth itself had paused to witness the confrontation that would soon unfold. The cave loomed ahead, dark and unyielding, its jagged mouth exhaling a suffocating heat. Deep within its shadowy depths, the python stirred, its massive coils shifting with a sound like rocks grinding against each other. Its hissing breath echoed, a sinister warning to any who dared to approach. The oracle of Delphi, the sacred site of prophecy, lay within its grasp, its divine wisdom shackled by this ancient beast. Apollo stood before the cave, his golden hair catching the sunlight, his youthful face set with unshakable resolve. The bow in his hand shimmered, its string taut with anticipation. The python's presence polluted this holy place, and Apollo, god of light and music, would not allow such darkness to endure. Yet, there was no denying the beast's power, a serpent so vast and ancient that its legend stretched back to the beginning of time. A low growl rumbled from within, the earth trembling beneath Apollo's feet. The python was awake, its malevolent eyes glowing like twin embers in the blackness. "You dare to challenge me, child of Zeus," it hissed, its voice a rasping blend of contempt and fury. "This sanctuary is mine. Leave now, or you will join the bones that litter its floor." Apollo stepped forward, his presence radiating an aura of light that pushed back the encroaching shadows. "This place is sacred, meant for truth and guidance, not for fear and death," he said, his voice steady. "Your reign here is over." The python uncoiled itself, its massive form emerging from the cave. It was a nightmare given flesh, its scales glistening with a dark, otherworldly sheen. Its eyes locked onto Apollo, filled with a hatred as ancient as the earth. "You are bold, godling, but your light will be snuffed out like a candle in the wind," it spat, venom dripping from its fangs. Without another word, the python lunged, its jaws opening wide to swallow the god whole. Apollo leaped aside with the grace of a dancer, his golden bow already drawn. He loosed an arrow, its tip blazing like a comet, and it struck the python's thick hide with a sharp crack. The beast recoiled, its roar shaking the mountains, but the arrow barely pierced its scales. It lunged again, faster this time, its massive coils crashing down like a wave, aiming to crush the god beneath its weight. Apollo rolled to safety, his mind racing. This was no ordinary battle, it was a clash of elemental forces, light against darkness, order against chaos. He fired another arrow, then another, each one aimed with deadly precision. The python writhed, its movements growing more frenzied as Apollo's arrows began to find their mark. But the beast was relentless, its strikes coming faster, its hissing breath filling the air with venomous fumes. The battle raged on, the ground scorched and scarred by their conflict. Apollo's golden light clashed with the python's shadow, the two forces locked in a struggle that seemed to shake the heavens. The god's arrows flew with unerring accuracy, each one glowing like a ray of sunlight piercing the dark. But the python was cunning, using its immense size and strength to its advantage. Its tail lashed out, striking Apollo with a force that sent him sprawling across the ground. For a moment, Apollo lay still, the breath knocked from his lungs. The python loomed over him, its massive head descending, its fangs glistening with venom. "This is the end for you, godling," it hissed, its voice a cruel whisper. But Apollo's resolve burned brighter than ever. Summoning all his strength, he raised his bow and fired a single, blinding arrow. The shot found its mark, striking the python in its open mouth and driving deep into its throat. The beast reared back, its roar of pain echoing across the land. Apollo was on his feet in an instant, his bow singing as he loosed another volley of arrows, each one striking with the force of divine retribution. The python thrashed wildly, its massive body tearing through the earth as it tried to escape the relentless assault. Apollo pressed his advantage, his movements swift and precise, his golden light growing ever brighter. With one final, earth-shaking roar, the python collapsed, its massive form falling still. The beast's fiery eyes dimmed, its life extinguished by the god's unyielding will. Apollo stood over his fallen foe, his chest heaving, his golden bow still glowing with residual light. The cave, once a place of darkness and fear, seemed to breathe again, its oppressive weight lifted. The oracle of Delphi was free, its sacred wisdom once more within reach of those who sought it. The gods themselves watched from above, their faces filled with awe and respect. Apollo had not only claimed victory but had also restored balance to a place of immense power. His triumph was a testament to the strength of light, of truth, and of the unyielding spirit that refuses to bow to darkness. The python's massive body began to dissolve, its essence returning to the earth from which it came. Apollo's golden light filled the cave, illuminating the oracle's sacred seat. The battle was over, but the memory of it would echo through eternity, a tale of courage, determination, and the power of light to banish even the darkest shadows. The battlefield stretched endlessly beneath a sky choked with dark clouds, the air electric with tension. Warriors stood frozen, weapons clutched tightly, their eyes darting between the two towering figures at the heart of the chaos. On one side was Ares, the embodiment of fury and bloodlust, his armor splattered with the stains of countless battles. His war cry, raw and feral, echoed like thunder, shaking the resolve of even the bravest. On the other side was Athena, calm and composed, her gaze steady beneath her gleaming helmet. Her golden shield reflected the dim light, a symbol of unshakable strategy and foresight. The silence before the storm was deafening. Ares raised his blood-soaked spear, its point glinting menacingly. "Athena," he snarled, his voice a growl that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, "you may wear armor, but you lack the heart of a true warrior. Step aside, or be crushed beneath the weight of my wrath." Athena stood her ground, her eyes unwavering. "Strength without thought is nothing more than chaos," she replied, her voice calm but cutting. "You fight for the thrill of destruction. I fight for victory that endures." The ground beneath them trembled as Ares lunged forward, his spear slicing through the air with brutal force. Athena sidestepped effortlessly, her movements as precise as the stroke of an artist's brush. She countered with a swift thrust of her sword, the blade aimed to exploit a weakness in Ares' defense. But Ares was quick, his shield deflecting the strike with a deafening clang. The clash of their weapons sent sparks flying, illuminating the faces of the warriors who dared not intervene. Ares fought like a storm unleashed, each blow a testament to his raw power. His strikes were relentless, his roars shaking the very ground beneath them. Athena, however, was a steady in control. She anticipated his moves, turning his aggression against him. Every dodge, every parry was a lesson in patience, her focus never wavering. Ares' frustration mounted with each failed attempt to land a decisive blow. His attacks grew wilder, his movements less disciplined. "Stand still and fight like a god," he bellowed, his voice tinged with desperation. But Athena's calm only deepened, her strategy unfolding like a chess game, each move calculated to expose Ares' recklessness. Then came the moment when Ares' fury reached its peak. He hurled his spear with all his might, the weapon tearing through the air like a bolt of lightning. Athena raised her shield, and the impact sent a shockwave rippling across the battlefield. The force pushed her back, her heels digging into the earth, but she stood firm. When the dust settled, she lowered her shield and locked eyes with Ares. "You waste your strength in anger," she said, her voice steady. "But anger is blind. Let me show you what clarity looks like." She moved with purpose, her sword flashing like a streak of light. Her strikes were precise, aimed not to overwhelm but to dismantle. She targeted the weak points in Ares' armor, each blow chipping away at his confidence. Ares roared in defiance, his massive sword swinging in wide arcs, but Athena was always a step ahead. She ducked, spun, and struck, her movements a seamless dance of strategy and skill. The tide began to turn. Ares, once an unstoppable force, now seemed weighed down by his own rage. His swings grew slower, his breaths heavier. Athena seized the moment, delivering a calculated strike that knocked his sword from his grasp. The weapon clattered to the ground, and Ares staggered, his chest heaving. For a moment, the battlefield was silent except for the sound of their labored breathing. Ares glared at Athena, his eyes burning with defiance. But beneath his fury was a flicker of doubt, a realization that brute strength alone could not win this battle. Athena lowered her sword but did not relax her stance. "War is not about who strikes hardest," she said, her voice carrying across the battlefield. "It is about who endures, who plans, who understands the cost. You fight for glory, Ares. I fight for something greater." Ares fell to his knees, his head bowed. The warriors around them watched in stunned silence, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief. The god of war, brought low by the goddess of wisdom, not through sheer power, but through strategy, patience, and unshakable resolve. Athena turned her back to Ares, her golden armor catching the faint light that broke through the clouds. The battle was over, but its lesson would echo for ages to come. War, she had shown, is not won by the strongest, but by the one who understands its true nature. The skies above Mount Olympus darkened, the heavens trembling as if the world itself anticipated the conflict to come. Hera stood atop the marble steps of Zeus's grand throne room, her eyes blazing with an intensity that rivaled the sun. Her golden robes shimmered with an otherworldly light, and the peacock feathers adorning her scepter seemed to quiver, reflecting her fury. Across the room, Zeus sat on his throne, his face a mask of calm, though the lightning crackling in his eyes betrayed his own brewing storm. "What you've done, Zeus," Hera began, her voice steady but laden with venom, "is an insult not just to me, but to the sanctity of the bonds we swore. Do you think your power places you above loyalty? Above respect?" Zeus leaned back, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips, his fingers idly tracing the armrest of his throne. "Hera, my queen," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "you speak of loyalty as though you've not wielded your own influence to bind the wills of others. Shall we compare sins?" Her grip on the scepter tightened, and the air around her grew heavy. The clouds that gathered outside thickened, swirling into ominous vortexes. "This isn't about sins," she replied, her voice sharp. "It's about the imbalance you've created. You forget that even gods must answer for their actions." The room itself seemed alive with tension, the pillars trembling as Hera took a step forward. Zeus rose from his throne, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the chamber. His hand reached out, and with a simple gesture, the sky above split open. A jagged bolt of lightning pierced through, its deafening crack shaking Olympus to its core. "Careful, Hera," he said, his tone hardening. "You may find that power wielded against me only reflects back upon you." But Hera was unmoved. She raised her scepter, and the ground beneath them rumbled in response. Vines of ethereal energy snaked up from the cracks, twisting and coiling, as though the earth itself had chosen to side with the goddess of marriage and queen of the heavens. The vines shot toward Zeus, glowing with divine wrath. Zeus countered with a wave of his hand, summoning a shield of pure light that dissolved the attack before it could touch him. "I am the king of gods," Zeus roared, his voice echoing like thunder. "The cosmos bends to my will. And I am the queen." Hera fired back, her voice rising to meet his. "Do not mistake your throne for an excuse to treat me as lesser." Their words were not mere shouts, they were weapons, each syllable charged with divine energy that rippled through Olympus. The very air between them shimmered as their powers collided, sparks flying in every direction. Hera conjured a torrent of winds, sharp as blades, that lashed toward Zeus. He retaliated with a strike of lightning that split the marble floor between them, the jagged edges glowing molten red. The battle was as much a clash of wills as it was of power. Hera fought with precision, every move calculated, every strike aimed at exploiting Zeus's overconfidence. She knew him well, too well, and used his arrogance against him. Zeus, for all his might, relied on brute strength and unrelenting force, his attacks meant to overpower rather than outthink. At one point, Hera's winds encircled him, binding him in a vortex that seemed impenetrable. For a moment, it appeared she might gain the upper hand. But Zeus let out a roar that shook the heavens, his body radiating a blinding light that shattered the winds like glass. He stepped forward, unscathed, his eyes blazing. "Hera," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "you fight as though you have forgotten who commands the thunder." "And you fight as though you've forgotten what it means to stand as equals," she replied, her voice unwavering. She raised her scepter high, and from it erupted a golden wave of energy that surged toward Zeus like a tidal wave. The force of it was staggering, bending the walls and shattering the stained glass windows of the throne room. Zeus raised his arms, summoning a barrier of storm clouds that absorbed the brunt of the attack, but the effort left him visibly shaken. Their powers raged on, the skies above Olympus reflecting their turmoil. Thunder rolled, lightning streaked across the heavens, and the earth quaked beneath their feet. The other gods watched from afar, too awed or too fearful to intervene. They knew that this was no mere quarrel, it was a battle that would reshape the dynamics of the pantheon. Hera's strikes became faster, her resolve burning brighter with each moment. She pushed Zeus to the edge of his endurance, her determination unyielding. But Zeus, too, was relentless. He called upon the full force of his dominion over the skies, summoning a storm so fierce that it drowned out everything else. Rain poured, winds howled, and the lightning that struck seemed to come from every direction at once. Hera stood amidst the chaos, her golden armor gleaming despite the deluge. She raised her arms, her voice cutting through the storm like a blade. "You cannot silence me, Zeus. Not with your storms, not with your power." Zeus paused, his breath heavy, his chest heaving. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Hera saw it, and she pressed forward, her voice softer now but no less powerful. "This isn't about who is stronger," she said. "It's about understanding the balance we were meant to uphold. You rule, yes, but you do not rule alone." The storm began to subside, the wind slowing, the rain easing. Zeus lowered his arms, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room lingered, heavy and unbroken, as the two deities faced each other in silence. The battle had ended, but its echoes would linger, a reminder of the delicate balance between power and partnership. Hera's gaze softened, but her stance remained firm. She had fought not just for herself, but for the respect and equality that the throne of Olympus demanded. Zeus, though bruised and weary, nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the truth in her words. The night was still, the only sounds the gentle whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. Yet, in the stillness, something moved, something swift, something clever. Hermes, the god of travelers and tricksters, was on a mission. His eyes sparkled with determination as he darted between shadows, his winged sandals barely making a sound as they carried him across the ground. Ahead of him, far in the distance, lay his prize, Argus, the ever-watchful giant with 100 eyes, guarding the nymph Io, trapped in her cow form. Io, once a beautiful mortal, now a creature cursed by Zeus's jealousy, was a prize that Hermes was determined to rescue. But standing in his way was Argus, who had eyes watching in every direction, never closing, never missing a movement. Hermes knew the challenge ahead. He could not outmuscle Argus. The giant was too strong, his senses too sharp. But Hermes was not a god of brawn, he was a god of wit. With a small smile playing on his lips, he knew it was not strength that would win this battle. It was cunning. He approached the sleeping Argus from behind, taking care to keep his steps light and soundless. The 100 eyes of Argus were scattered across his body, blinking and darting in all directions, but none saw Hermes in the darkness. Hermes, ever the trickster, had a plan. He took out his reed pipe, a gift from Apollo, and began to play a soft, mesmerizing tune. The melody was light and sweet, its notes floating through the night air like a dream. Slowly, as if in a trance, the eyes of Argus began to close one by one. The music lulled the giant into a deep, almost hypnotic slumber, his body relaxing as the song wrapped around him like a blanket. Hermes grinned, watching with quiet satisfaction as more and more eyes shut, one after another, until all of them were closed. Argus, now fully asleep, was no longer a threat. With silent footsteps, Hermes approached the cow form of Io, whose eyes were filled with fear and longing. Her body trembled, knowing that her only hope lay in the god who had come to her rescue. Hermes knelt beside her, gently laying a hand on her head. "It's time to free you, Io," Hermes whispered, his voice soft and reassuring. He took out a small vial, filled with a liquid that would reverse her curse. As he poured it onto her form, her body began to change. The cow's shape faded away, and Io, once more a woman, stood before him. Her eyes were wide with wonder and gratitude, but they also held a deep sadness, the weight of the curse she had carried for so long still evident in her gaze. But there was no time for words now. Hermes knew that Argus would not sleep forever. With a quick motion, he took out a sword and, in one swift stroke, severed the head of the giant. The air around them seemed to still as Argus's body slumped to the ground, lifeless. The 100 eyes, which had once watched everything, now lay silent and still. Hermes turned to Io, his face filled with compassion. "You're free now," he said gently, his words carrying the weight of a promise kept. But Io's eyes, though free of her curse, were still filled with sorrow. She had been through so much, betrayal, pain, and now freedom. But freedom was not without its costs. She would have to leave behind her past, the life she had known, and the life that had been stolen from her. She had seen too much, endured too much, and now, in the quiet aftermath, she stood on the edge of a new life, unsure of what would come next. Hermes took her hand, his touch warm and comforting. "You have a new beginning now," he said softly. "It's not the life you once knew, but it is yours. And I will be here to guide you." They stood there for a moment, the weight of the moment hanging between them. Argus's body lay sprawled on the ground, his eyes forever closed. The stars above twinkled in the clear sky, as if watching over the two gods and the woman who had been freed. With one last glance at the fallen giant, Hermes turned and began to lead Io away. Her steps were hesitant at first, but with each step, she seemed to find herself again. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in so long, she felt hope. The darkness that had once surrounded her was now receding, and the light of a new dawn was breaking through. The journey ahead would not be easy, and Io would carry the scars of her past with her. But as she walked alongside Hermes, the god of travelers, her heart felt lighter. For the first time in ages, she felt as though she could breathe freely, unburdened by the curse that had held her in its grip for so long. And as they walked into the night, the sound of Hermes's reed pipe carried softly on the wind, a reminder of the cleverness and bravery that had freed Io from the watchful eyes of Argus. It was a victory not just of strength, but of wit, of the quiet courage that comes when one dares to outsmart the greatest of obstacles. The night, once heavy with tension, now felt full of possibilities. And in that moment, Io realized that she was no longer just a victim of the god's whims. She was free, truly, finally, free. The air in Thebes was thick with pride, a pride that burned in the chest of one woman, Niobe. She stood in the center of her palace, her eyes gleaming with defiance as she looked out over her land. Children surrounded her, laughing, playing, their voices like music to her ears. 12 children in total, 7 sons, 5 daughters, each one a blessing from the gods. She stood tall, her chest puffed out, her gaze directed toward the heavens. She had everything a mother could ever want. In the temple of Apollo, the priestess spoke of the god's greatness, but Niobe's thoughts were different. She did not need the gods. She was the true goddess of motherhood. While Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, had only 2 children, Niobe had 12, and she would show the world who was truly blessed. Her voice rang out across the city, her words dripping with arrogance. "Leto, you think you are the greatest? You have 2 children, how foolish. I have 12, each one more precious than the last. Her words cut through the temple air like a blade. She could almost hear the silence that followed her proclamation, but the weight of her hubris was already too great to stop. She did not understand that pride, especially toward the gods, comes with a price. It was then that Artemis heard. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, the protector of women and children, could feel the sting of Niobe's words all the way in her divine home. It wasn't just the insult to her mother, Leto, that hurt, it was the arrogance that had dared to question the gods. Niobe had forgotten her place. And for that, there would be a reckoning. In the quiet moonlight, Artemis stood alone, her bow in hand. She had no need for words, she had a purpose. With swift and determined steps, she moved toward Thebes, her heart heavy with the task ahead. It was not a task she wanted, but one she knew must be done. Niobe's laughter had long faded from the halls, but the sting of her arrogance still hung in the air like smoke. As Niobe sat with her children that night, unaware of the punishment that was coming, she took a moment to admire her life. She was untouchable. She was immortal in her own eyes, and she would see her legacy carried on through her children. But then the sky darkened. The moon, usually so bright and comforting, seemed to disappear. The air grew still, as if holding its breath. Niobe's instincts tingled, but she could not place the unease. It was too late when she looked up to see Artemis standing before her, a chilling presence in the moonlight. "No," Niobe whispered, her confidence faltering. Artemis did not speak. She didn't need to. In a single, fluid motion, her bow was drawn, and an arrow flew across the sky, aimed directly at Niobe's eldest son. The child collapsed with a single, silent cry. The silence in the room was deafening. Niobe's heart skipped a beat. "What have you done?" Niobe gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she rushed toward the lifeless body of her son. But before she could reach him, another arrow struck down another child, and then another. Her world shattered. One by one, her children fell. She could hear their cries, their desperate pleas, but no one could save them. Each arrow was guided with the precision and coldness of a goddess who had seen too much. Her pride had brought this wrath upon them all. "Stop. Please. I have learned my lesson." Niobe screamed, her voice hoarse with grief, her body trembling as she fell to her knees. She reached out toward Artemis, but it was no use. Artemis's eyes, cold and unforgiving, watched as the final arrow was loosed. The last of Niobe's children fell, and the final silence descended on the city. Niobe, her voice now choked with tears, could hardly breathe. The proud, powerful woman who had once stood so tall now crumbled in despair, her eyes empty, her spirit broken. Her hubris had cost her everything. She had dared to challenge the gods, to place her own power above theirs, and now her children lay dead before her, their lives snuffed out by divine wrath. The heavy weight of her arrogance crushed her, and she knew in her heart that nothing would ever undo the damage. Her voice, once full of pride, now broke with the sound of a mother who had lost everything. And yet, there was something else. The ache of her pride had turned into a bitter understanding, one that would stay with her forever. In her grief, Niobe began to realize the truth: she had never been the goddess of motherhood. The gods had given her everything, and they had taken it all away in an instant. The fragile nature of life, the power of divine will, this was the lesson she had failed to learn. As Artemis watched from the shadows, her heart remained untouched. She had done what needed to be done. Her wrath was not born of hatred, but of justice. The gods, after all, must be honored and respected, not mocked. The punishment had been severe, but necessary. Niobe's cries echoed into the night, but no one could hear them. Her legacy would never be remembered with the same reverence as she had once hoped. The pride that had once filled her heart now turned to ashes in her chest, and there was nothing left but the emptiness of regret. Artemis turned away, her task complete. Her heart may have been cold, but even gods could not escape the weight of such actions. What had been done could not be undone, and as the moonlight washed over her, Artemis knew that this was the way of the world. Power, strength, and pride were fleeting, but divine justice was eternal. In the silent, cold night, Niobe was left to grieve, not just for her children, but for the pride that had led her to this terrible fate. Her tears would fall forever, but no one would ever see them. No one would ever hear the mourning of a mother who had lost everything because of her own pride. The earth trembled beneath their feet, the ground cracking open as if it could no longer hold the weight of their anger. Towering figures, their bodies as large as mountains, moved across the battlefield with terrifying strength. The giants had risen, their fury unleashed upon the world of the gods. The sky darkened as the war raged on, the clash of giants against gods threatening to tear the very heavens apart. For the gods, this was no ordinary conflict. It was a battle for survival, a fight to protect not just their power, but the very essence of their existence. Their enemies were not mere mortals, these were beings of immense strength, born from chaos itself. Their size and power were beyond imagination, their roar shaking the heavens. The world had never seen a force like this. Among the gods, there was a sense of dread, a recognition that this battle could change everything. The giants' strength was immense, but their arrogance and pride were even greater. They believed that they could overthrow the gods and take their place as rulers of the heavens. But the gods would not let that happen. Not without a fight. Zeus, the king of the gods, stood at the head of the divine army, his eyes burning with the fire of determination. His thunderbolt crackled in his hand, the power of the sky itself waiting to be unleashed. Around him stood his fellow gods, each one preparing for the battle ahead. Athena, wise and calculating, gripped her shield tightly. Apollo, god of the sun, readied his bow, the string humming with potential. Ares, the god of war, was already charging toward the battlefield, his heart beating in time with the rhythm of battle. But it was not just the gods' weapons that gave them strength. It was their unity, their bond as a family that would see them through. They fought not just for power, but for each other, for the world they had built together. This was not just a battle for survival, it was a fight to protect everything they held dear. As the first giant moved toward them, the ground beneath his feet cracking and splintering, Zeus stepped forward, his voice thunderous as he called upon the power of the heavens. The giant paused, feeling the weight of the sky itself bearing down upon him. Zeus raised his thunderbolt, and with a flash of lightning, he struck. The bolt hit the giant with such force that it sent him sprawling to the ground, the earth shaking with the impact. But the giant was not defeated. He rose again, his anger and pride only growing stronger. Athena stood beside Zeus, watching carefully, her mind racing. She knew that brute strength alone would not win this battle. The giants were too strong, too relentless. But there was something else, the gods had wisdom on their side. She turned to the others, giving them a quick nod before rushing into battle. Her sword flashed through the air, cutting down one giant after another. With each strike, her heart raced, knowing that every blow brought them closer to victory, but also closer to the edge of destruction. The battle raged on, gods and giants locked in a struggle that seemed endless. But despite their power, the gods were not invincible. Ares fought with all his might, his strength and fury unmatched, but even he began to tire. Apollo's arrows flew true, but the giants seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him. The gods had underestimated the power of their enemies. The giants were relentless, and their anger knew no bounds. As the battle reached its peak, a new figure entered the fray. A being of terrible beauty, her eyes glinting with cold fire. It was Hera, queen of the gods, her presence commanding and powerful. She stepped forward, her voice ringing out like the clash of thunder, her hands raised in the air. The sky above darkened even further as she called upon her divine power, summoning the very earth itself to rise up against the giants. The ground trembled as massive rocks rose from the earth, crashing down upon the giants. The god's strength, combined with Hera's control over the earth, turned the tide of battle. The giants roared in fury, but it was no use. One by one, they fell to the combined power of the gods. Their pride, their arrogance, had led them to this moment, to their ultimate downfall. But the victory came at a cost. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of fallen giants and gods alike. The sky, once filled with the fury of battle, was now eerily silent. The gods stood amidst the destruction, their faces grim, their hearts heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Zeus surveyed the battlefield, his thunderbolt still crackling in his hand, but his eyes were filled with sorrow. This victory had not come without great loss. The gods had won, but the battle had left scars that would not easily fade. The earth was scarred, the heavens shaken, and the gods themselves forever changed. This was not just a battle for power, it was a reminder of the fragility of existence. And yet, even in the face of such loss, there was a glimmer of hope. The gods had stood together, fought together, and in the end, they had prevailed. The giants, in all their strength and arrogance, had fallen, and the world was safe once again. But the cost of that safety would linger long after the battle was over. The gods, though victorious, would carry the weight of this battle for eternity. As the dust settled and the echoes of the battle faded away, the gods turned their eyes to the future. They had won this battle, but they knew that the world would always be a place of conflict. There would always be those who sought to challenge the gods, to test their strength, their power, their resolve. But the gods had proven that they were not easily defeated. Their power was not just in their strength, it was in their unity, in their ability to stand together in the face of overwhelming odds. In the end, the gods' victory was not just a triumph over the giants. It was a triumph of hope over despair, of unity over division, and of love over hate. It was a reminder that, no matter how fierce the battle, the gods would always find a way to protect their world, their family, and everything they held dear. The clash of armies echoed through the hills, a thunderous roar that shook the very earth beneath them. The plains between Thebes and Argos were stained with the blood of warriors, the cries of battle filling the air like a song of destruction. It wasn't just men that fought here, gods and heroes, too, moved in the shadows, their fates tied to the outcome of this war. Every footstep, every blow struck, carried with it a weight that went far beyond the battlefield. The air was thick with the promise of death, and yet in the midst of it, the gods played their hands. Their influence, their power, seeped into every corner of this war, guiding mortal and immortal alike. The world itself seemed to hold its breath, as if knowing that this war, like all wars before and after, was never just about what happened on the field, it was about the forces of destiny and pride that moved like a tide, sweeping all before it. At the heart of the chaos stood two families, the sons of Oedipus and the kings of Argos, each with their own legacy, their own claim to power. Eteocles and Polynices, brothers bound by blood but torn apart by ambition, led the forces of Thebes. They were not just warriors, they were symbols of their city, of the ancient curse that had followed their family. Their fight was personal. Their hatred was born of betrayal, and their bond, once so strong, had turned into a weapon. The blood of their father, Oedipus, ran through their veins, a bloodline stained with tragedy and doomed by the gods. On the opposite side, King Adrastus of Argos stood at the helm, his heart heavy with the weight of his people's fate. His army, made up of 7 powerful heroes, marched into the storm with a singular purpose, to conquer Thebes and restore honor to their land. Their leader, Tydeus, a warrior of fierce renown, fought not just for victory but for revenge, a desire to make right what had been wronged by the gods themselves. The first clash between the two armies was brutal. The ground trembled under the weight of armor and swords as the soldiers charged, their faces grim with determination. The gods watched from above, their eyes glowing with both pride and fury. Athena, goddess of wisdom, guided the hands of the Argive heroes, while Apollo, the god of prophecy, whispered warnings and curses to the Thebans. But it wasn't just the mortal warriors who fought, the gods had their own grudges, their own reasons for intervening. On one side of the battlefield, a hero named Amphiaraos stood tall, his face set in grim resolve. A seer, a man who had foresaw the coming of his own death, yet could not resist the call of war. He was bound by honor, and yet the words of the gods weighed heavily upon him. His heart ached as he stood in the midst of battle, knowing that this would be his final fight. It was a fate that the gods had set for him, and he could do nothing but embrace it. As the spear thrusts and sword swings grew fiercer around him, his mind kept returning to the same thought: could fate be avoided? Could he have escaped the doom that the gods had laid out for him? And yet, for every man like Amphiaraos, there was another who reveled in the glory of battle. Tydeus was one such man. His blood ran hot with the thrill of combat. He fought not for the city, not for honor, but for himself, for the pleasure of the fight. He charged into the heart of the battle with the fury of a wild beast, his eyes burning with a rage that threatened to consume him. His hands were stained with the blood of countless men, and yet it was never enough. He wanted more. He wanted to prove that even the gods could not stand in his way. As the battle raged on, the gods themselves began to move, their presence shifting the tides of fate. Hera, queen of the gods, lent her favor to the Thebans, her fury fueling their courage. Her whispers guided the hands of the soldiers, urging them to fight on against impossible odds. But not all the gods were so easily swayed. Poseidon, with his deep, unforgiving heart, stood on the side of Argos, his mighty trident cutting through the sky as he sought to guide the Argives to victory. The gods themselves, divided in their loyalty, waged their own battle above, while below, the mortals fought for survival. As the hours passed, the field became littered with the fallen. The clash of steel and the roar of warriors grew quieter, replaced by the mournful cries of the dying. Eteocles and Polynices, now locked in combat with one another, were no longer the brothers they had once been. Each blow they struck felt like a betrayal, each moment of victory a bitter reminder of the loss of everything they once shared. They were no longer fighting for their city, they were fighting for themselves, for their own pride, for their own broken hearts. In the midst of the carnage, the gods began to take notice of the devastation they had wrought. Their intervention had changed the course of the battle, but they had not expected the cost to be so high. Athena, watching as the Thebans fought with a desperation that matched her own, could feel the weight of their suffering. Her hand, once steady, now shook as she guided her heroes. Apollo, too, watched with a heavy heart as the bodies piled high on both sides. And yet, the battle raged on. The blood of heroes and kings, of gods and mortals, stained the earth beneath them. Every strike, every wound, carried the weight of history. The war was no longer just a fight for land or power, it had become a test of endurance, a battle of wills. Would the gods continue to intervene? Or would they watch as their creations tore each other apart? As the final moments of the battle drew near, it became clear that this war, like so many before it, was a war of fate. Mortals had fought valiantly, but the gods' influence could not be denied. The city of Thebes would not fall, not because of the might of the Argives, but because the gods had decided it would be so. And yet, even in the face of divine power, the warriors of both sides fought with a ferocity that would echo through time. In the end, the war between Thebes and Argos was not just a war of men. It was a war of gods. A war that would change everything. For even in victory, there would be no peace. For the gods and mortals alike, the battle was never truly over. It was only just beginning. The sun was scorching, hanging high in the sky, as the wind swept over the plains of Marathon, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. The air felt thick, charged with a nervous energy. The earth trembled beneath the feet of the soldiers, their bodies weighed down with the heat, the dust, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. In the distance, the mighty Persian army stood ready, their banners fluttering like the promise of inevitable victory. They had come to conquer, to spread their influence, and nothing seemed like it could stand in their way. But on the opposite side, there was something different. The Greeks, small in number, stood tall with fierce determination in their eyes. They were outmatched. They were exhausted. And yet, they were united by something deeper than fear or even hope, something greater than just the will to survive. It was the knowledge that they were fighting not just for themselves, but for their way of life, for their freedom, for their families. They stood on the edge of history, knowing that the battle they were about to fight would echo for generations to come. As the Persian army advanced, the ground seemed to shake with each step they took. Thousands of soldiers, their faces grim, their hearts cold, surged forward like an unstoppable wave. They were warriors of a vast empire, seasoned and numerous, and they believed their victory was assured. Their king, Darius, had sent them to crush the Greeks. The battle would be swift, decisive. But the Greeks had something that the Persians could not predict, something that could not be measured in the weight of swords or the number of soldiers. They had the favor of the gods. In the quiet moments before the clash, the warriors of Athens could feel it. It was like a whisper on the wind, a divine presence that made the hairs on their necks stand at attention. The goddess Athena, protector of Athens, stood with them. Her divine favor was a shield, her strength a force that coursed through the very air they breathed. They could not see her, but they could feel her. It was the quiet reassurance of knowing they were not alone. The gods were watching. As the two armies collided, the sound was deafening. The clash of shields, the cries of men, the pounding of feet, it all melded into a single, monstrous noise that could drown out any thought. But in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. The Greeks, though outnumbered, fought like lions. Every spear thrust, every sword swing, carried with it the fury of 1,000 storms. It was as if the gods themselves were lending their strength to the Athenian soldiers. The battle raged on, blood staining the earth, the sky turning darker with the smoke of war. Yet, despite the odds, the Greeks began to push back. They were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for something far more sacred. It was the freedom to live, to think, to speak, to be something more than mere subjects to a king. They fought with an intensity that seemed to grow with each passing moment, each fallen warrior, each enemy that fell before them. But it wasn't just human resolve that pushed them forward. The gods, it seemed, were on their side. Athena's favor guided their blades, and the whisper of Zeus himself echoed in their ears. The very air seemed to bend to their will, as though the universe had shifted in their favor. The Persian army, once so certain of their victory, began to falter. Their lines broke. The overwhelming numbers that had once seemed like a guarantee of success now became their greatest weakness. The Greeks, in their fury, pressed forward with the full might of their resolve, determined not to let this moment slip away. In the heart of the battle, the Athenian general, Miltiades, stood firm. His eyes were sharp, his mind calculating. He had no intention of simply surviving this battle, he intended to win. With the gods at his back and the might of his warriors around him, he led his men with unyielding courage. Every moment felt like a question: could they hold? Could they triumph? And every time he looked into the eyes of his soldiers, he knew they would not break. They were more than men now, they were warriors touched by fate, shaped by the very will of the gods themselves. As the tide turned, the Persians, who had once been so sure of their victory, now found themselves in retreat. Their formation, once flawless, began to crumble. The Greeks, with a fury that could only be born of desperation, pressed forward, cutting down their enemies with a relentless ferocity. The battle was no longer about strength or numbers, it was about will, about spirit. The gods had made their choice. The victory would not belong to the Persians. In the final moments of the battle, as the last of the Persian forces fled, there was a heavy silence that fell over the battlefield. The cries of battle had faded, replaced by the sounds of labored breathing, the cries of the wounded. The Greeks stood victorious, though their bodies were broken and bloodied. But they had done it. Against all odds, they had won. The gods had favored them, but it was their strength, their resolve, that had carried them through. As the soldiers looked around at the battlefield, the true weight of the victory settled in. They had not only defeated an empire, they had preserved their freedom. They had protected their families, their homes, their way of life. And in that moment, they knew that the Battle of Marathon would go down in history not just as a military victory, but as a symbol of everything they stood for. The gods had been with them, but it was the unshakable will of the human spirit that had carried them to triumph. And as they stood on that blood-soaked earth, they knew they had made history. The wind howled across the choppy sea, the waves crashing against the sides of the ships as though nature itself was preparing for the storm that was about to break. The salty air burned in the lungs, mixing with the fears that hung heavy in the hearts of the men aboard the Greek triremes. They stood ready, their eyes locked on the horizon, where a massive shadow stretched out, an armada of Persian warships, so vast that it seemed to swallow the sea whole. The odds were insurmountable. The Persian fleet was enormous, far larger than the Greeks' humble ships. The Persian king Xerxes had come with everything, his pride, his empire, and a ruthless determination to crush those who dared stand against him. It was the final test, the moment that would decide the fate of Greece. The Battle of Salamis was not just a clash of ships, it was a battle for the very soul of a nation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Greeks gathered their courage. Their backs were to the cliffs of Salamis, the island where their fate would be sealed. The men were tired, their bodies bruised and broken from months of war, but they were united by something that no fleet, no army, no king could take from them: their will to survive. Every soldier knew what was at stake. It wasn't just their homes, their families, their future, it was their identity. Their way of life. The air was thick with the sounds of preparations. The ships rocked with the force of the waves, but the men on board were silent, their focus unwavering. They could hear the distant sounds of Persian horns, the rhythmic beat of war drums echoing across the sea. The Persians were coming. And they would come with everything they had. There would be no mercy. The battle began as the Persian fleet advanced, a massive wall of ships moving with the cold precision of an unstoppable force. The Greeks had no choice but to stand their ground. The waves rose higher, crashing harder, as if they too were aware of the battle to come. Then, a sharp command rang out. It was the signal. The Greeks, waiting for their moment, moved in. The triremes, sleek and nimble, cut through the water with the fury of warriors born of desperation. Every oar stroke pushed them forward with brutal strength. The Greek fleet was smaller, but they had something the Persians lacked. They had speed, agility, and the element of surprise. The Persians, with their massive ships, were slow and cumbersome. The Greeks used the narrow strait to their advantage, drawing the Persians in like prey. And then, the first clash. The Greek ships slammed into the Persian fleet, their bronze rams cutting through the wooden hulls with a sickening crunch. The water around them turned dark with blood, the sounds of battle growing louder as the two forces collided with a force that seemed to shake the earth itself. It was chaos, a whirlwind of screams, steel, and the sound of wood splintering under the weight of each strike. The Persians, so sure of their superiority, began to falter, their ships trapped in the narrow waters, unable to maneuver. The Greek commanders, led by Themistocles, moved with precision, their orders sharp and swift. Every ship was a weapon, every movement calculated for maximum damage. They were not fighting for glory or conquest, they were fighting for survival, for the future of their children and their homes. There was no room for mistakes. And they made none. The sea was their ally. As the battle raged on, the wind seemed to shift in the Greeks' favor, pushing the Persian ships further into the traps set for them. Every move the Greeks made was a dance of death. The ships glided with unnatural speed, turning and cutting with a grace that left the Persian ships struggling to keep up. The noise was deafening, the clash of swords, the roar of men, the tearing of wood. Each moment was a new wave of chaos, a new threat. But through it all, the Greeks held fast. And in the middle of this madness, Themistocles stood at the helm of his ship, his heart beating with a rhythm of its own. His hands gripped the wheel with white-knuckled force, his eyes scanning the horizon, looking for the next strike. The gods, it seemed, had given them this moment. The wind, the waves, even the very sea itself was on their side. But there was no time to savor it. Every second counted. The Persian ships, one by one, began to break apart, their crews fleeing or being overwhelmed. The Greeks did not relent. They were relentless, driven by something that would not be quenched, by the belief that they were more than just soldiers. They were the last line of defense against tyranny. As the battle wore on, the sea turned darker, not just with the blood of the fallen, but with the shadow of defeat hanging over the Persian fleet. Xerxes watched in disbelief from the shore, unable to comprehend the collapse of his mighty armada. He had underestimated them, he had underestimated the strength of the Greeks, the strength of men who fought not for riches, not for power, but for their families, their land, their gods. His fleet was broken. His dream of conquering Greece was slipping through his fingers like sand. But it wasn't just the skill of the Greek warriors that won the day. It was their resolve. They were not fighting for themselves alone. They were fighting for something greater. Their homes, their freedom, their families. And as the last of the Persian ships burned on the horizon, as the sound of victory rang through the air, there was a profound sense of relief, of triumph against all odds. The Greeks had done it. They had defeated the Persians, not with brute force, but with something much more powerful, the strength of a united people, willing to fight and die for their future. The sea, once a battlefield of chaos and death, now seemed calm. The blood had been washed away, the ships broken, and the horizon clear once more. The Greeks had won. And in that moment, they knew they had made history. The gods had been with them, but it was their courage that had carried them through. The Battle of Salamis would echo for centuries as a testament to the power of human will, a reminder that even against impossible odds, the heart of a warrior, fueled by love for their land and people, can overcome anything. The sun barely touched the horizon, casting long shadows over the narrow pass of Thermopylae. The air was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and fear, but there was something else, something ancient, almost sacred, that hung in the atmosphere. This was no ordinary battleground. This was the place where fate would be sealed, where men would stand between their homes and a tide of destruction. 300 warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces grim with the weight of what was to come. Their armor, worn and battered, reflected the dull light of the morning. These men were not fighting for glory, not for riches, not for any of the rewards that others might seek in battle. They were fighting because there was no other choice. The Persian Empire, with its vast armies, loomed on the horizon, and the world as they knew it was about to change. The only way to stop it was to make a stand here, at this narrow, unforgiving pass. At the front of the line was Leonidas, their king. His eyes were hard, but there was a tenderness in them too, one that only his soldiers could understand. The fate of his people rested on his shoulders, yet there was no hesitation in his heart. He would not flee. He would not surrender. He would fight. For Sparta. For Greece. For all that they held dear. The sound of marching grew louder, the thunder of thousands of Persian feet shaking the earth beneath their feet. The Persian army, endless as the night, stretched out for miles. They were led by Xerxes, a king so certain of his own power that he believed victory was inevitable. But there was no fear in the hearts of the Spartans. There was only resolve. The Persians reached the pass. They looked at the 300 men before them and laughed. How could such a small force stand against such overwhelming might? But the Spartans, unmoving, did not flinch. They knew the odds. They knew they were vastly outnumbered. But they also knew that this was their home, and they would die defending it if they had to. The first wave of Persians crashed against the Spartan line like a flood. The sound of metal on metal rang out, echoing across the pass. But the Spartans stood firm, their shields locked together, their spears thrusting forward with deadly precision. Each blow they struck was like the heartbeat of a people who refused to be crushed. The battle raged on, relentless and unforgiving. The Persians, with their numbers and their power, pressed on, but the Spartans fought with the fury of men who knew they had nothing left to lose. Each life they took, each Persian warrior that fell, was a testament to their courage, their strength, and their undying love for their homeland. They were not fighting for themselves. They were fighting for their families, their children, their future. As the day wore on, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and the sweat of battle soaked into the soil. The Spartans, though outnumbered, fought with a skill and discipline that made every Persian advance feel like an insurmountable wall. The Persians grew frustrated, their attacks growing more desperate with each passing moment. The Spartans, however, showed no signs of slowing down. They were unyielding, like the mountains themselves. But as the sun began to set, a new threat emerged. A traitor had shown the Persians a secret path, a way to flank the Spartan position. The Greeks, who had stood as one, now faced the reality that they were surrounded. Leonidas, knowing that the battle was lost, did not falter. He turned to his warriors, his brothers in arms, and gave them one final command: fight on. And so they did. The battle became more intense, the sound of swords clashing, shields splintering, and men shouting in the heat of combat filled the air. The Spartans were still standing strong, but the weight of the numbers was beginning to take its toll. One by one, they fell, but their bravery never wavered. They fought not just for victory, but for the memory of their people, for the future that would be stolen if they were to fall. Leonidas, seeing his soldiers fall beside him, knew the end was near. His heart, though heavy with grief, was resolute. He had led his men to this place, and now, with a sense of duty beyond his own life, he would die with them. The sound of his own breath, quick and shallow, was drowned out by the roar of battle. He fought on, his body and spirit entwined in the defense of his people, knowing that even in death, their sacrifice would not be in vain. In the end, Leonidas fell, his body surrounded by the bodies of his comrades. But the spirit of those 300 men would not die. Their sacrifice ignited a fire in the hearts of the Greeks. Their bravery inspired the armies of Greece to rise against the Persians in ways that the world had never seen before. The Battle of Thermopylae was not one of victory in the traditional sense. The Persians claimed the pass, but they could never claim the honor and glory of those who fought and died there. The Spartans had given everything, and in return, they had earned something far more powerful than a simple military victory. They had earned the respect of their enemies, the admiration of their countrymen, and the eternal memory of their sacrifice. And though the world may have forgotten the names of many of those who fell on that fateful day, their courage lived on in every freedom fighter, every warrior who ever stood against tyranny. The gods may have tested them, but it was the heart of the Spartans that proved strongest. Their names, like the very rocks of Thermopylae, would never be forgotten. As the sun set that night, the sky seemed to weep for the fallen, its red hues reflecting the blood of those who had given all for something greater than themselves. The battle was over, but the legacy of those 300 men would echo through history for generations to come. The wind howled through the broken walls of Thebes, carrying with it the echoes of a curse that had haunted generations. The ground was soaked with the blood of men who had come to fight, and the city itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the past. There was something in the air, an electricity, a sense that something terrible was about to unfold, and yet, it had already begun. At the heart of the battle, the gates of Thebes stood tall, defiant. Behind them, the city's defenders, their faces hardened by years of conflict, watched the horizon as the seven approached. These men were not just warriors, they were bound by a curse that had been placed upon their families long ago. It was a curse that had driven them to this moment, to the point of no return. A curse of revenge, of honor, and of fate. The seven had come to Thebes not just as soldiers, but as avengers, determined to bring justice for the wrongs done to their families. But as they stood in front of the great city, a heavy silence fell over them. Each one carried the weight of their ancestors' sins. They knew the cost of revenge, but they could not turn back now. This was their destiny. Their fate had been sealed long ago. The city of Thebes had no chance against them. The seven were warriors of unparalleled strength and skill, their names etched into the annals of history. But Thebes had its defenders, 2 men who would die to protect their homes, their families, and their gods. The 2 sides were destined to clash, not just in the mortal realm but in the very heavens above, as the gods themselves watched with bated breath. The first clash was deafening. The earth itself seemed to shake as the seven and the defenders of Thebes collided. The sound of steel on steel rang out, reverberating across the battlefield. For a moment, the world stood still. The blood of fathers, brothers, and sons mixed with the dirt and dust of the earth. Lives were torn apart in the blink of an eye, each death a reminder of the curse that had led them here. At the front of the seven stood Polynices, the leader of the assault. His heart beat heavy in his chest, the weight of his family's shame driving him forward. He had come to avenge his father's exile, to reclaim the throne that had been stolen from him. But as he fought, the faces of his fallen comrades seemed to appear before him, haunting him with the knowledge that no matter what he did, they would never be at peace. On the other side stood Eteocles, the king of Thebes, the man who had taken his throne. He fought with the fury of a man desperate to protect his home, his blood, his legacy. But in his heart, there was a sadness, a quiet understanding that this battle was never about power. It was about the blood that had been spilled, the curses that had been passed down through the generations. The gods had willed it so, and neither man could escape the path they had been set upon. The battle raged on, each side determined to claim victory. But the land was cursed, the gods unrelenting in their demand for retribution. It was a fight not just between men, but between families, between destinies. Each strike was a cry for justice, each death a testament to the long-reaching effects of betrayal. As the battle wore on, the gods watched from above, their faces unreadable. There was no mercy here. The curse was not just a thing of men, but of the divine. The gods had placed their mark upon this conflict, and no one, no matter how noble, no matter how strong, could escape their will. In the heat of the battle, the gods themselves seemed to take form. They guided the hands of the warriors, pushing them toward their destinies. Each strike felt fated, each move choreographed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The seven fought with all their might, but the gods seemed to mock them, guiding their enemies' hands with cruel precision. It was as though the gods were ensuring that the curse would be fulfilled, that the blood of their families would flow until the last breath was drawn. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the final confrontation came. Polynices and Eteocles, the two brothers, stood face to face, their eyes filled with a mixture of rage and sorrow. The weight of their shared history pressed down upon them, suffocating them. They knew that this moment was inevitable, that their fates had been sealed the moment their father had been exiled. This was their destiny, and there was no escaping it. Their swords clashed with a sound that could be heard across the battlefield, and the world seemed to pause for a brief moment. It was a moment of pure violence, but also of pure tragedy. They were brothers, flesh and blood, yet they were enemies, bound by the curse that had been passed down from their ancestors. Polynices' strength was unmatched, but Eteocles fought with the desperation of a man who had everything to lose. Each blow they struck against each other was a reminder of the pain they had caused one another, of the years of bitterness and anger that had led them to this moment. Neither man was willing to yield. Neither man could be the first to fall. The battle around them slowed, as if the gods themselves had suspended time. The entire world seemed to hold its breath as the two brothers fought not just for victory, but for redemption, for peace. But peace would not come. The curse would not be broken. And in the end, there was no victor. Both men fell, their blood staining the earth beneath them. The gods had spoken, and the curse had been fulfilled. The battle of the seven against Thebes was over, but it was a hollow victory. Revenge had been had, but at a terrible cost. The curse had been passed down, unbroken, through the blood of those who had died. The gods would continue to watch, as they always had, knowing that the cycle would never end. The bloodshed, the anger, the sorrow, they would echo through the ages, passed down through the generations, until the gods saw fit to end it. The heavy, ominous silence in the palace of Mycenae was deafening. It was the kind of silence that settles over a place when blood is about to be spilled, when death is only a breath away. The air was thick with anticipation, a suffocating weight that hung over every corner. Inside the palace walls, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, returned home from the bloody shores of Troy, triumphant yet unaware that his victory would be the death of him. He stood in the doorway of his palace, weary and battered from the long years of war. His heart, however, was light with the thought of his return. He would finally be reunited with his wife, Clytemnestra, and their children. He had sacrificed so much for his kingdom, for his people, for the gods. Little did he know, it was not the enemies of Troy who awaited him now, but the wrath of his own family, a wrath that would demand its price. Clytemnestra had waited, patient and vengeful, while Agamemnon fought in the Trojan War. She had watched the years slip by, years that had not been kind to her. The king's long absence had given rise to a deep, bitter fury in her heart. But it wasn't just the absence. It was the sacrifice he had made, the sacrifice of their daughter, Iphigenia, a life taken to appease the gods before the war had even begun. For Clytemnestra, that sacrifice was unforgivable. And now, after all these years, the time for revenge had come. As Agamemnon entered his palace, he was unaware of the storm that was brewing inside it. The doors creaked open, and Clytemnestra, standing there like a figure from the shadows, greeted him. Her smile was sweet, but there was nothing warm about it. Her eyes burned with something darker, something that Agamemnon could not yet see. She stepped forward, her arms outstretched in a gesture of love, as if she had been waiting for him forever. But it wasn't love that would greet him this time. The moment Agamemnon stepped into the grand hall, he felt the weight of the world upon him. He had fought in the war, fought for his people, for his family's future. But as he walked through the familiar halls of his palace, he felt an unexplainable chill. It was as though the very walls were closing in on him. He looked around, but his eyes never saw the danger. He couldn't sense it. The gods had long abandoned him. Clytemnestra's voice rang out, smooth and steady, a silken thread drawing him deeper into the trap she had set. "Welcome home, my king," she said, but the words were like poison in his ears. She led him to the grand bath, a bath prepared just for him, for his long, weary body that had endured so much. Agamemnon stepped into the bath, and as the warm water enveloped him, he let out a sigh of relief, thinking only of rest and peace. But peace was something Agamemnon would never find again. In the shadows, hidden from view, Clytemnestra prepared herself. She was ready, steady with her resolve, her heart hardened by years of grief and anger. She would not hesitate. She could not. This was the moment she had waited for, the moment that had been building since the death of her daughter. The gods had witnessed his sacrifice, and now they would bear witness to his punishment. The knife gleamed in the dim light as Clytemnestra stepped forward, her face now a mask of cold determination. Agamemnon's head sank into the water, his eyes half closed in exhaustion. He did not see her approach. He did not hear her soft footsteps against the stone. He never knew what struck him. The blade came down in an instant, the sound of metal tearing through flesh ringing in his ears, but there was no time to react. There was no time to defend himself. His blood mixed with the water, the colors swirling together in a macabre dance. Clytemnestra stood over him, the knife still in her hand, her heart racing. She could feel the pulse of vengeance in her veins, her hands trembling with the weight of the deed. Agamemnon's lifeless eyes stared up at her, his body still warm but already slipping away. She had done it. She had avenged her daughter. But at what cost? Her breath caught in her throat as she looked down at him, her king, her husband. In that moment, the full weight of her actions hit her. She had murdered the father of her children, the man she had once loved. The blood of her family was now stained on her hands. The gods had demanded retribution, but in fulfilling their will, she had lost a part of herself. There was no joy in this victory. There was only emptiness, a hollow space where love and peace once resided. And yet, the curse of her family's bloodline had been fulfilled. Iphigenia's death had been avenged, and Agamemnon lay dead at her feet. The gods, silent and watchful, had seen the justice carried out. The Furies, the embodiments of vengeance, no longer whispered in the shadows. Clytemnestra had brought an end to her torment, but her soul would never be free. As she stepped away from Agamemnon's body, Clytemnestra's mind swirled with thoughts of what lay ahead. The children, Orestes and Electra, would return soon, and they would have questions. What would she say to them? How could she ever explain her actions? Could they ever understand the depth of her pain? Would they see her as a murderer, or as a mother who had done what she thought was right? But before these questions could torment her further, the palace doors creaked open. Clytemnestra's heart leapt in her chest as she turned toward the sound. It was not just the gods who had seen this. The vengeance of her family had only just begun. Agamemnon's bloodline would not rest easily, and the curse of Mycenae would carry on. The wind howled through the ancient stone corridors of the palace, as though it too had heard the call of vengeance. Inside, Electra sat in the shadow of her father's death, the weight of grief pressing her chest so tightly she could scarcely breathe. Her hands were clenched, her nails biting into the flesh of her palms, and yet, it wasn't just sorrow that swirled within her. There was something darker, a fire, something that burned in her heart, something that would not rest until the bloodline of Atreus was avenged. Her eyes were distant, yet they held an unmistakable resolve. Agamemnon, her father, the man who had led the Greeks to victory at Troy, lay cold and lifeless, a victim of his wife's treachery. Clytemnestra had taken the life of the very man she had once pledged to love, but it was not just an act of betrayal. It was a tragedy, one that had shattered the very foundation of their house. And Electra knew that no matter how much she wished to turn away, there could be no peace until her mother paid for what she had done. Across the hall, Orestes, her brother, stood in silence, his eyes dark with the same torment that gripped his sister. He had not been there when their father died, but he had heard the whispers, the stories carried by the wind, the rumors that had reached him even in his exile. And in those whispers, a burning question had formed: what is justice? The gods had abandoned their house, it seemed, but there were still debts to be paid. And the two siblings, bound by blood, would carry the weight of their family's vengeance. Orestes had returned, a man now, though the sight of his home filled him with a cold emptiness. The walls of Mycenae seemed to echo with the ghosts of his past, and he knew that it was time for him to face the dark path that had been laid before him. He walked toward Electra, his face hard but his heart still raw from the years spent away, wandering with the heavy shadow of what had happened. Electra turned to him. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of years. "Orestes, it's time." Her words were simple, but they spoke volumes. It was time to confront the truth, time to face what had been done. Their mother had killed their father. And now, it was their turn to strike. The siblings shared a look, one that only they could understand. It was a bond forged in suffering, in the loss of innocence, in the knowledge that the blood of their father had been spilled by the hands of their own flesh and blood. No forgiveness would come from the gods. No redemption would come from the heavens. Only revenge could bring justice. The air in the palace seemed to grow heavier as Orestes and Electra made their way through the darkened halls, toward the throne room where Clytemnestra waited. They knew what had to be done, and neither could allow weakness to take root in their hearts. Their mother, the woman who had borne them, raised them, and loved them, was the very one who had torn their world apart. She had no place in their future. When they reached the room, Clytemnestra stood before them, regal and composed. Her face bore no remorse, only a cold, unyielding expression. She had acted in the name of vengeance, too, in the name of the daughter she had lost. But there was no room for understanding here, no space for mercy. The gods had already spoken, and justice would be served. Orestes stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "Mother, you have slain the king, our father, and the house of Atreus will never know peace until your blood is spilled in turn." For a moment, Clytemnestra's gaze softened, her eyes clouded with a flicker of something, perhaps regret, perhaps fear. But she quickly steeled herself. "You think you can defeat me, Orestes? You think you can erase the pain I have carried for so long?" Her voice wavered, but her stance remained unwavering. She had suffered, too, but in the face of death, there was no room for apologies. There was only retribution. "I did what I had to do." But Orestes didn't flinch. His heart was a battleground, torn between the love he had once known and the justice he now craved. He looked at his mother, not with hatred, but with a heavy, hollow sadness. "I don't want this," he whispered, his voice cracking. "But I have no choice." And with those words, the deed was sealed. Electra's eyes remained on her mother, her hand steady on the hilt of the sword she had taken up. The battle within her heart was not an easy one. She had once loved her mother. She had once seen her as the protector of their family, the keeper of their home. But love could not undo the past. And love could not bring back their father. She was torn between the life she had known and the one that must be lived. The gods had set their course, and there was no turning back. With one final, soul-shattering cry, Orestes lunged. The sword plunged into Clytemnestra's chest, the force of it shocking both the killer and the victim. For a long moment, Clytemnestra didn't fall. She simply stood there, eyes wide with disbelief, the breath in her lungs slowly leaving her, as if she, too, was coming to terms with what had been done. The room was still, suffocating in its quiet. The scent of blood filled the air, thick and heavy, staining the stone beneath their feet. And in that silence, there was no sense of victory, only the shattering of a family. The vengeance of the house of Atreus had been fulfilled, but at what cost? As Orestes and Electra stood over the body of their mother, the weight of what they had done settled into their bones. There would be no turning back now. No matter how much they might want to undo the pain they had caused, they could not. They had avenged their father, but they had also become part of the curse that had haunted their bloodline for generations. And so, they stood, together but alone, in the ruined palace of their ancestors, knowing that this was just the beginning of a long and bloody path that would follow them to the ends of the earth. The gods had spoken, and there was no escaping their will. The blood of Atreus would never wash clean, not in this life or the next. The earth trembled beneath the boots of the soldiers, their hearts pounding like war drums, louder than the wind that howled through the hills. The clash of metal against metal, the screams of warriors falling, the shouts of triumph and anguish, it all mingled together in a horrific symphony. This was the moment that had been foretold, the moment that the sons of the Seven, who had once sought to destroy Thebes, now stood at the gates of the city, intent on finishing what their fathers had started. It was a war born of hatred, of revenge, and of promises unkept. The city of Thebes had defied the will of the gods, had withstood the wrath of the seven mighty heroes, and now the sons, each driven by their own blood-fueled oath, had returned to claim what was rightfully theirs. But in the heart of battle, it wasn't just the blood of the fallen that stained the earth. It was the weight of their fathers' ghosts, the shadow of ancient grudges, and the burden of legacy. Among the men marching toward the great city was Alcmaeon, son of Amphiaraos, a warrior whose fate had long been intertwined with the curse of his father. His heart was heavy as he looked toward the walls of Thebes. His father had perished in the first war, one of the seven who had been betrayed by his own allies, condemned to death by a false promise of victory. Amphiaraos had been a man of honor, but in the end, it was deceit that had taken him. Now, his son, Alcmaeon, had returned for justice, a son who had heard his father's last words echo in his ears, a plea for revenge, a plea for Thebes to fall. Yet, Alcmaeon could not deny the doubt that gnawed at his soul. Was this truly justice? Or was it simply the continuation of a cycle of destruction that would never end? The thought clung to him, making his every step feel heavier than the armor on his chest. Beside him marched the sons of other fallen heroes, men like Thersander, the son of the great Polynices, whose desire for vengeance burned bright. Polynices had died fighting for Thebes, but his death had been a bitter one, filled with the stain of dishonor. His son would not let that stain go unchallenged. The memories of his father's defeat and disgrace pushed him forward, urging him to show Thebes the price of their defiance. And there was the young, fiery Eteocles, son of the great Adrastus. His heart had known nothing but hatred for Thebes. They had taken his father's life, and now he would return to reclaim what was owed. Each step he took toward the city felt like the tread of fate itself, a march that could not be stopped. There was no turning back now, he had committed himself to this fight. The sky above them darkened with the rage of the gods, thunder crackling in the distance as though the heavens themselves watched with bated breath. The army was ready, and so were their hearts, filled with determination, rage, and a thirst for revenge. But as the gates of Thebes loomed closer, something strange began to stir within them. It wasn't fear, but something else, something darker, more ominous. The battle began like a storm, fierce and relentless. The sound of weapons clashing echoed through the valley as the sons of the seven pushed forward, each of them driven by the ghosts of their fathers, each step carrying the weight of those who had died before them. The earth was soaked with blood, some from the young, some from the old, and some from those whose only sin was being caught in the cycle of vengeance. But for all their strength, for all their fury, the sons of the seven were not invincible. They were mortal, and the gods had a way of reminding them of that in the most painful ways. Alcmaeon, in the heat of battle, faced a warrior who seemed to embody the spirit of Thebes itself, strong, unyielding, and relentless. The two men collided, their swords ringing out, their fury matched in every strike. But as Alcmaeon's sword found its mark, as he finally brought down his foe, he felt a strange emptiness. It wasn't the rush of victory he had expected, it was a hollow feeling, as though something precious had been lost in the moment. Thersander, too, found himself lost in the fog of war. He had been driven by the desire to avenge his father's death, but now, as he stood over the body of a fallen warrior, he realized that the vengeance he had sought had not brought the peace he had imagined. It had only led to more destruction, more blood. His father's death had been avenged, but at what cost? The people of Thebes had fallen, but so had the sons of the Seven, and for what? What had they truly gained? The battle raged on, but the more the sons of the Seven fought, the more they began to see the futility of it all. Thebes had fallen, its walls breached, its people scattered, but what had been accomplished? Was there true justice in this, or merely the endless repetition of a cycle of violence? Alcmaeon's mind raced as he surveyed the battlefield, his father's last words echoing in his ears. The gods demand justice, but who will save us from the vengeance that has consumed us all? And then, as the battle reached its peak, as the warriors of the Seven raised their weapons in triumph, a terrible truth began to settle upon them. The gods had watched them from above, but they had not intervened. The victory was theirs, but at a cost they had never anticipated. The blood of the fallen soaked the earth, and the sons of the Seven stood victorious, but there was no joy in their hearts. In the end, they had destroyed Thebes, yes, but they had destroyed themselves in the process. The gods had asked for blood, and the sons had given it willingly, but now, standing amidst the carnage, they realized the terrible price of vengeance. The victory was theirs, but their fathers' ghosts, and their own, would haunt them forever. There was no peace in this war, no redemption, no absolution. Only the knowledge that the cycle would never end, and that one day, another generation would rise to claim the same bloody revenge, just as they had. The earth quaked with the fury of 1,000 hearts. The sound of marching feet reverberated through the narrow mountain passes, echoing off the cliffs like a storm about to crash down. At the foot of Mount Parnassus, the sacred land of Delphi stood against the horizon, bathed in the golden light of the early morning. But that light was not enough to chase away the growing darkness creeping across the land. Delphi, the heart of the ancient world, the place where the gods spoke, was in danger. The oracle, the great priestess, had warned of it. The very ground upon which Delphi stood was sacred, protected by the gods themselves. But now, those same gods watched with a mix of pity and resignation as mortals clamored for control over the divine. The temple, the sacred spring, the very stones of Delphi, they were all in peril. And so it began, the battle for Delphi. The warriors of the Amphictyonic League had come to defend the sacred site, but they were outnumbered, outmatched by a host of invaders. The Gauls, fierce and wild, had come with one singular purpose, to claim Delphi for themselves. Their swords gleamed in the sunlight, their battle cries filled the air, and their eyes blazed with the fire of ambition. At the heart of the defending forces stood a single figure, the leader of the League, a man who had devoted his life to protecting the sacred site. His name was Anamarchus, and his soul was bound to Delphi as tightly as the mountains that surrounded it. His warriors, too, were willing to die to protect the oracle's temple, to safeguard the knowledge that flowed from the gods. There was no higher purpose than this. Anamarchus stood at the front, his eyes scanning the enemy lines. The Gauls were relentless, their momentum unyielding, and they knew no fear. But he could feel something within him, a stirring, as though the very land itself was telling him something, warning him. Do not fail. Protect this place, or all will be lost. With a battle cry, Anamarchus led his forces into the fray. The sound of weapons clashing, the smell of blood and sweat, the cries of the dying, it was all too familiar, too real. The ground beneath their feet shook as the two armies collided, warriors falling like leaves before the wind. The battle for Delphi was no simple clash of soldiers. This was the defense of something sacred, something beyond mortal understanding. The defenders fought not just for themselves, but for the future, for the very soul of Greece. Every sword strike, every death, was an offering to the gods, an attempt to prove that Delphi deserved to remain untouched, pure, and safe from those who sought to defile it. But the Gauls were relentless, their brutality on full display. They had no love for the gods of Delphi. They cared nothing for the sanctity of the place. Their bloodlust was unchecked, their thirst for conquest driving them forward. They pushed through the lines of the defenders, cutting down those who stood in their way with a ferocity that seemed unstoppable. Anamarchus fought like a man possessed. His sword was an extension of his will, striking down any enemy that dared to come near him. He fought for Delphi, for the oracle, for the future of Greece, but as the battle raged on, he began to feel the weight of the fight, the realization that, no matter how hard they fought, the enemy was too strong, the tide too powerful. In the chaos of the battle, Anamarchus found himself face to face with the leader of the Gauls, a towering figure whose eyes burned with the fury of 1,000 storms. They circled each other, eyes locked, the silence between them filled with the weight of their destinies. Anamarchus could feel the weight of the gods on his shoulders, the knowledge that Delphi's future rested on this single moment. The clash of their swords was like thunder. Steel met steel with a crash that could be heard for miles, the sound reverberating through the valley. Anamarchus fought with everything he had, every ounce of strength, every drop of blood, but the Gauls' power was overwhelming. The invader pushed forward, his sword in unstoppable force. Anamarchus was forced back, his every movement filled with desperation. He could hear the cries of his men around him, could feel the ground beneath him quaking with the weight of the battle. But even as the Gaul pressed on, Anamarchus refused to give in. The thought of Delphi's destruction, of the oracle's fall, was too much to bear. He could not let it happen. The gods had entrusted him with the defense of this sacred place, and he would not fail them. In that moment, something miraculous happened. The earth itself seemed to tremble in response to Anamarchus' resolve. It was as though the gods had heard his silent plea, his desperate cry for help. From the hills surrounding the valley, a great force appeared. A wave of soldiers, led by the great warriors of Delphi, surged into the battlefield. They were not alone. The gods themselves had answered, intervening at the final hour. With divine aid, Anamarchus and his men rallied, their strength renewed. The Gauls, for the first time, hesitated. They had not expected such a turn of fate, and they faltered. In that brief moment of uncertainty, Anamarchus struck. With a final, decisive blow, he felled the leader of the Gauls, sending his forces into disarray. The battle raged on, but now, the gods had intervened. The tides of fate had shifted. The Gauls, no longer driven by their leader's forceful presence, began to retreat. The defenders of Delphi, emboldened by their divine aid, pressed on, driving the invaders back from the sacred site. As the last of the Gauls fled, the battlefield fell silent. The warriors of Delphi stood victorious, but the cost had been great. The bodies of the fallen lay scattered across the land, both defenders and invaders alike. The ground was soaked with blood, the air thick with the smell of death. But Delphi had been saved. The sacred site had stood its ground. Anamarchus, standing amidst the carnage, breathed heavily. His sword, once gleaming, was now caked in blood. His body ached, his mind exhausted. But there was something else, something deeper that stirred within him. It was the knowledge that Delphi had not just been saved by the strength of warriors, but by the will of the gods. It was a victory, but it was a hard-earned one, a victory that would be remembered for generations to come. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the battlefield, Anamarchus knew one thing for certain: Delphi would never be the same. The gods had spoken, and their intervention had changed the course of history. The night fell over the shores of the Thracian Sea like a heavy curtain. The Argonauts, weary from their long journey, docked their ships at a secluded beach, the waves whispering against the hulls. Exhausted and eager to rest, they disembarked with the hope of finding shelter, food, and a safe place to stay for the night. But as they unloaded their supplies, a quiet tension lingered in the air, unnoticed by many. The Dolions, the people of the land, had been watching them from the shadows, unsure of the strangers who had come to their shores. It started as a simple misunderstanding. The Argonauts, their minds focused on the promise of rest, did not realize that they had sailed into hostile waters. The Dolions, a proud and fierce people, had not yet received word of who these visitors were. Seeing strange ships docked on their shores, they assumed the worst, an invasion, a threat to their land, their homes, their very way of life. As the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, the Argonauts began to gather their weapons, unaware that they had been spotted. The Dolions, seeing this as a sign of aggression, prepared for battle. In the growing light, the clash seemed inevitable, two groups, both seeking nothing more than peace, unknowingly drawn into the storm of misunderstanding. The tension between them grew thicker, each side poised for violence, a tragic dance of miscommunication and fear. At the heart of this impending disaster stood Jason, leader of the Argonauts, a man who carried the weight of 1,000 hopes upon his shoulders. He had fought for years to assemble the greatest crew ever known, to reclaim the Golden Fleece, and to forge a destiny that would be remembered throughout history. But on this day, he stood in front of his men, unaware that the real battle was not with monsters or gods, but with the simple frailty of human perception. The Dolions were not strangers to battle. Their warriors, strong and brave, stood ready to defend their homeland. But their leader, King Cyzicus, was a man of honor. He had once welcomed travelers to his shores, offering them peace and hospitality. He did not wish for bloodshed. Yet, the pressure of the moment weighed heavily on him. With his men rallying around him, he knew that once the first blow was struck, there would be no turning back. A tense silence filled the air, broken only by the distant cries of the seagulls. It was in that silence that the tragedy began. A young Dolionian warrior, unable to hold his nerves, lunged toward the nearest Argonaut. The sharp clash of metal against metal broke the stillness, and in an instant, chaos erupted. Screams filled the air, the sound of fighting, the clashing of swords, the cries of men and women caught in the whirlwind of battle. The Argonauts, surprised and unprepared, drew their own weapons in defense. Jason rushed forward, shouting for his men to hold back, to stop the fight before it escalated further. But his voice was drowned out by the noise of battle, by the fury of fear and misunderstanding. The Argonauts, seasoned warriors though they were not immune to the confusion that gripped them. They fought back, each blow struck in defense, not knowing who they were fighting, not knowing that they were shedding the blood of people who had meant no harm. On the other side, King Cyzicus fought with the strength of a lion. He, too, did not wish for this battle, but his people were under threat, and he had to protect them. As he clashed with the Argonauts, his heart heavy with the weight of the mistake he believed was inevitable, he felt the crushing sorrow of what had been lost in the fight. With each strike, each blow, he could not stop the pain that began to gnaw at his soul. This was not his people's way. This was not the honor of the Dolions. And then, as quickly as the battle had begun, it ended. The sun was higher in the sky, its light now casting long shadows over the blood-soaked earth. The fighting slowed, the screams turned to murmurs, and the realization hit like a hammer: this was no battle for glory or for conquest. This was a battle of sorrow, a battle born from confusion, from a simple failure to understand each other. On the ground, the bodies of the fallen lay silent, their lives snuffed out by a cruel twist of fate. Jason, his face pale, stood amidst the wreckage of the battlefield, his heart heavy with grief. He had led his men to victory, but at what cost? The Dolions, brave as they were, had fought to protect their land, their families, their way of life. And now they lay scattered on the ground, each one a reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. Cyzicus, too, stood in the midst of the chaos, his sword still in his hand, his eyes wide with the shock of what had just occurred. He had fought against the Argonauts, believing them to be invaders, not knowing they were the same warriors who had once promised peace. The faces of the dead haunted him. He could not undo what had been done. Among the Argonauts, the sorrow was no less. They looked at the fallen Dolions, men and women who had done nothing wrong, and their hearts broke. They had been driven by fear and the need to protect themselves, but now, as they saw the faces of the fallen, they understood. There was no honor in this fight. There was only the weight of a mistake that could never be erased. And then, as the dust began to settle and the sun cast a mournful light over the battlefield, Jason stepped forward. His heart was torn, his soul heavy with the weight of loss. He raised his hands, signaling for silence. The men of the Argonauts, their swords still drawn, turned to him. Jason's voice was low, but it carried across the quiet field. "We were wrong," he said simply. "We did not come here to fight. We came seeking refuge. But we have done something terrible, something unforgivable. And for that, we are sorry." The Dolions, their own grief reflected in their eyes, listened in silence. There was no need for further words. The cost of the misunderstanding had been paid, not in gold or glory, but in lives, lives that could never be replaced. As Jason stood there, looking out over the fallen bodies, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He understood now that even the greatest of heroes could be blinded by misunderstanding, that even the bravest of warriors could make mistakes. And in that moment, as the sound of the waves washed over him, Jason knew that this was the true price of a hero's journey, the burden of regret, the pain of loss, and the knowledge that some battles could never be undone. Odysseus stood at the edge of his homeland, the familiar sight of Ithaca stretching out before him, his heart heavy with the weight of 12 long years spent away from his family, from his life. His journey had been nothing short of harrowing, facing gods, monsters, and countless trials that had tested not just his body, but his very soul. Yet now, as the salty breeze of the island kissed his skin, the feeling of home was bittersweet. There was no welcome waiting for him. No cheers, no warm embrace. Instead, there was only the gnawing realization that everything he had fought for, the life he had once known, was slipping away from him. The men in his house, the suitors, had filled his home with their laughter, their arrogance, their entitlement. They had taken over, feasting at his table, drinking his wine, wooing his wife, Penelope, with empty promises and deceitful words. They did not know he was alive. They did not know that the great Odysseus had returned. But he knew, and with every passing day, his anger grew. How could they do this to him? To his family? The gods may have kept him from returning sooner, but now, as he stood at the threshold of his home, the weight of his rage was unbearable. It wasn't just the suitors he wanted to punish. It was the very idea that his kingdom had fallen into disarray, his throne usurped by men who had no right to sit there. It was the thought of his son, Telemachus, growing up without a father, struggling alone, watching as his mother was harassed by men who only wanted her for her beauty and wealth. Odysseus had fought for his country, for his family, for his honor. Now, it was time to take it all back. The plan had been set into motion long before his return. He knew the palace, knew its corridors, its rooms, its hidden corners where only a few trusted souls could hide. He knew how to strike when it counted, to move without being seen, to turn the tide in his favor. But as he stood in the shadows, he could not help but feel a moment of hesitation. Would his men stand with him? Would they remember who he was? Would they fight for him as they once did? Or had time and distance erased their loyalty? His son, Telemachus, appeared at his side, a man now, though still a boy in many ways. Odysseus had missed so much of his life, and the pain of that loss was a wound that would never fully heal. But there was no time for sorrow now. Telemachus had grown strong, and in his eyes, Odysseus saw not just the boy he had left behind, but the man who had taken his place. Together, they would fight. Together, they would reclaim what was theirs. The sound of the suitors filled the hall, their voices echoing in the grand chamber as they reveled in their power. They laughed as they drank, oblivious to the impending storm that was about to strike. They mocked the absent king, speaking of how they would never leave, how Penelope would have no choice but to choose one of them. They were wrong. They would never have her. They would never have his home. As Odysseus and Telemachus entered the hall, a cold silence fell over the suitors. Their eyes widened in shock, disbelief. The man they had mocked for so long stood before them. The legendary king, the hero of Troy, the one who had been thought lost to the seas. He was back. And they had no idea what they were about to face. Odysseus' voice rang out like thunder, low and commanding, carrying the weight of years of pain and suffering. You dared to take my home, my wife, my throne. You believed I was gone, that you could live without fear. But now, you will pay the price. The suitors, frozen in place, were unsure of what to do. Some stood, weapons half drawn, their arrogance faltering in the face of the truth. Others cowered, knowing that their fate had been sealed the moment Odysseus entered. But it wasn't just his words that struck fear into their hearts. It was the fire in his eyes, the raw intensity of a man who had been wronged and was now ready to make the world burn. The battle that followed was swift, brutal, and unrelenting. Odysseus and Telemachus fought side by side, a father and son united in their shared purpose. The suitors, despite their numbers, were no match for the fury of a king who had been robbed of everything he loved. Every strike was a reminder of the years lost, of the suffering endured. Each suitor that fell was not just a man defeated, but a symbol of the years Odysseus had spent struggling to return home, to reclaim what was his. The hall was soon filled with the sounds of battle, the clash of swords, the cries of the dying, the thud of bodies hitting the floor. Odysseus moved like a force of nature, his arrows flying true, his bow never faltering. Telemachus, too, proved himself a warrior, fighting with the same courage and strength that his father had once shown. Together, they were unstoppable. The suitors' arrogance and greed had led them to their doom, and now, there was no escape. As the last suitor fell, the silence that followed was deafening. The air was thick with the smell of blood, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore outside the palace doors. The task was done. Ithaca had been reclaimed, but at what cost? Odysseus stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving, his heart still pounding from the battle. The fire of rage that had driven him had burned out, replaced now by something more somber, grief, loss, and a longing for peace that would never truly come. The gods had tested him, and he had passed, but the victory felt hollow. Telemachus stood by his side, a hand on his shoulder, offering silent support. They had won. But the price had been steep, and the shadows of the past would always linger over them. Penelope would be waiting. Her face, once full of doubt and uncertainty, would now be filled with a mixture of joy and sorrow. She had waited for him for so long, her faith unwavering, but what kind of reunion awaited them now? Would they find solace in each other's arms, or would the years of separation leave them strangers, bound by duty but not by love? The sun set on Ithaca, casting long shadows over the ruined palace. The world had changed. Odysseus had returned, but the journey was far from over. The gods had tested him, the suitors had fallen, and yet, there was no peace. The battle was won, but the war within himself, within his family, was just beginning.